So, I'm of the mindset that everyone should know a little bit about cars. I've always been mechanically inclined, and it may have saved my life. A few years ago, I met a guy on a dating app. We talked for a few weeks before I was finally willing to meet with him. His dad owned a local gun store where I would go get my target stuff, since I used to be in competitive shooting. I had seen this guy around and had a decent impression of him, but I still wanted to be safe. He invited me to a concert at a local town site. It was a concert I really wanted to go to, and I figured it would be safe, since it was a well-known place with a lot of security. I let him pick me up because he wanted to show me his Mustang. He bragged about how well he kept it running and how he babied it. I was into time trial racing at the time, so I was interested to see what he had done. On the night of our date, he picked me up, and we began heading to the event. Right before the exit, he said his car was acting funny. I was watching the dashboard, and if you've been in racing, you know the cars usually have extra accessories, whether it's aftermarket racks and gauges or switches. There was nothing extra, and the car felt like it was shifting correctly. There were no strange noises or anything to indicate any problems. I told him that was weird, and suggested that we should try and limp it to the concert venue since it was less than a mile away, and it would be better than being stuck on the highway. He agreed, and drove very carefully for the last mile. When we got to the concert, he kept buying me drinks, and I kept noticing that he was staring at me. I refused to drink, so every time he brought me something, I'd take it to the bathroom and dump it out. As this went on, he kept making comments about how well I was handling the alcohol. There seemed to be something off with him, and I was super uncomfortable. Once the concert ended and it was time to leave, I noticed I didn't have any cell phone service, so I wasn't able to call anybody to come pick me up. I decided to bite the bullet and go with him, after I talked him into taking the old highway instead of the I-15. It sounds silly, but when you take the old highway, even though it's slower, people are more willing to stop and help you than they are on the freeway. I figured if he was having car troubles, it would be safer, and we wouldn't have people flying by us at 80 miles per hour. When we made it halfway between the town site and our town, he said the car was acting funny again and pulled over. I didn't notice anything wrong, so I got out of the car to check it out with him. He started making comments about how I was drunk and should wait in the car instead. At this point, the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, so I pulled out my phone. I noticed I had service again, so I texted my dad. As I was walking away from the engine compartment, I noticed he was watching me, so I started acting like I was trying to get cell service to get help. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched him take the spark plug wires off the distributor cap and switch the order. Spark plug wires connect to the distributor cap based on the order your cylinders fire in, so doing that will either make the car run terribly or prevent the car from even turning on. I managed to send my dad a picture of what he was doing, and he instantly replied and told me to start walking away. Just as I was about to start walking, the guy got back in the car and opened his glove box, which exposed a pistol he had. He told me not to worry and that we'd be safe. I probably broke a world record for how fast I was texting my dad. Again, he told me to start walking and tell the guy that he is on his way and that our friends live up the road. So that's exactly what I did. I started walking at a fast pace and took off as quickly as I could. As soon as the guy noticed, he started yelling at me, and I yelled back, saying I couldn't hear him but I was going to my friends. I was scared out of my mind. The closest road actually led to a cemetery, so there was absolutely no one around to help me. The further I walked, the bad feeling I had continued to get worse. For a quick second, I turned around and looked. The hood was closed and the lights of the car were on, so I decided to walk along the farm irrigation system next to the road where I'd be less visible. As I was texting back and forth with my dad, I heard a car slowly coming up behind me. I turned to look and saw that he was holding a flashlight out of the passenger side window, so I dropped down against the side of the ditch and waited, hoping he'd pass. Once I couldn't hear it anymore, I crawled out and continued walking along the weeds. After what felt like an eternity, my dad finally showed up in his truck. As we made it towards town, we passed the guy and saw that he'd been pulled over by 3 cops. I was pretty shaken up, but my dad told me not to worry about it, and all that mattered was that I was safe. Shortly after the incident, I learned that he had been charged with violent crimes in the past, and that he'd been arrested that night for concealed carrying without a permit. The police never talked to me, but I haven't seen that guy in town since. If I didn't have experience with cars and didn't know what he was doing, I could have been dead in that ditch instead of hiding. This guy knew that I knew about cars, but his whole goal was to get me so drunk that I wouldn't realize what was happening. When I was 10, my parents and I went to visit my grandmother for spring break. My cousin also came to visit, and we decided we wanted to go to the YMCA for the day. My grandmother dropped us off and said she would come and pick us up in 4 hours. On that day, the YMCA was empty. There were a couple of adults in the exercise room, but that was it. We went to the basketball court, and after 2 hours of playing tag and shooting baskets, we were bored. I've never been the biggest fan of swimming, but this YMCA had a pretty cool pool, so we changed into our bathing suits and headed in there. The pool was empty except for the lifeguard. We played a bunch of games and swam laps, but after about an hour, there wasn't much left to do and there was no one except us to hang out with to keep things interesting. So, we decided to play a game of seeing how long we could hold our breath underwater. We stood in the shallow end near the clock on the wall so we could time ourselves. Instead of fully submerging, we just stuck our heads face down in the water. We did this a couple of times, and I was winning. On our last round, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I figured it was my cousin giving up and telling me that I won, but instead, it was the lifeguard who told me to knock it off or she was going to ask us to leave the pool. Since we were tired of being in the pool, we figured we'd get out, get dressed, and go back to the basketball court until my grandmother picked us up. We only had an hour left anyways, and the water was freezing. As we got out, the lifeguard stopped us and asked if we wanted to go into the sauna to warm up and dry off. The sign said 18 years or older, so of course, we were super excited that she allowed us to do that. She walked us to the sauna and unlocked the door. The door was glass and the interior was made entirely out of wood. Inside, above the door, there was a clock, probably to help make sure you were not in there for an unsafe amount of time. The lifeguard stand was adjacent to the sauna, but if you looked out the door you could clearly see it. She followed us in and went over to the thermometer encased in plastic and unlocked it, so she could crank up the heat. I figured that she must have to turn it on each time, so I didn't think anything of it. Both my cousin and I were very short girls, so we couldn't see the temperature that was printed on the thermometer knob, but I knew she was turning up the heat. Then she left and shut the door behind her. I thought I saw her lock the door too, but I thought to myself, why would she lock the door when we might want to get out? I checked the clock and decided we should get out in 10 or 15 minutes. It was already plenty warm in the sauna, but now the room was blazing. It felt nice, because I was cold from the pool. After about 15 minutes, it was starting to get a little bit too hot, and my cousin and I agreed that we should leave so we can get dressed. I went to turn the knob on the door, but it wasn't budging. I thought it might have been jammed, so I shook it, but it still wasn't opening, and then I let my cousin try. She couldn't get it open either. We figured the lifeguard would be back in a couple of minutes, so we sat back down and waited. The room was getting hotter now too, and I really wanted to leave. I got up and started banging on the door, shaking and twisting the knob, trying to get the lifeguard's attention. My cousin got up and joined me. We started screaming at the top of our lungs for her to let us out, but she just stared straight ahead. I don't think there's any way that she could have noticed or heard two little girls banging and kicking on the door and screaming. Now we had been in there for about 25 minutes. It was so hot in the sauna that it hurt to breathe. It felt like my lungs were on fire. My eyes and skin were burning. We sat back down and put our towels over our heads because they were still a little damp and made it easier to breathe. I was so worried about my cousin since she's a couple years younger than me. I looked at the clock and saw that we had been in there for 35 minutes. I got up and walked to the door again and saw the lifeguard just staring straight ahead. Again, I tried to get her attention by screaming and banging on the door as hard as I could, but she didn't even react. I was starting to get pretty dizzy, so I went to sit back down, but the wooden seats of the sauna burned my skin. My towel was completely dry, so I put it underneath me to sit on. My hair was also dry, but I wrapped it across my face to cover my nose. I squinted my eyes so that they didn't burn as bad, but I could still watch if anyone walked past the door. It helped a little bit. My cousin was laying face down with the towel over her head, not moving or saying anything, so I nudged her to make sure that she was still okay. She was, but I could tell that we really needed to get out of there soon because she seemed a bit disoriented. It had been 45 minutes now, and I was extremely nauseous. There was no way that the lifeguard would forget that we were in there, and I thought she would have to come back soon, but there was this little voice in my head telling me that maybe she purposely locked us in there. Finally, a man walked past the door towards the pool, but for some reason, I just couldn't get up. My whole body was on fire and I felt so dizzy. Luckily, this man wasn't going to the pool. He wanted to be let in the sauna and came back with the lifeguard. I saw them walking this way and immediately jumped up to grab my cousin. I knew now that she for sure locked us in there because she pulled out her keys to unlock the door and let the man in. I didn't want to take any chances of us being trapped in there any longer, so as the man was trying to walk in, I was trying to shove our way out. As we were going out, the lifeguard started trying to shut the door and push us back with it. The man was clearly confused about what was going on and said, I think they want out. The lifeguard let out a sigh, opened the door fully, and we ran away as fast as we could into the changing room. We only had about 10 minutes before my grandmother was supposed to pick us up. We were both so shaken up by what had just happened that we didn't say anything to each other as we got dressed or on the car ride home. When we got back to the house, my parents were making us dinner, and I told them the story of what had just happened. They thought I must have been exaggerating, and they didn't believe me. I truly think that woman was going to let us cook alive in there. The only bit of doubt that I have is what would have happened if we actually died. She obviously would have gotten the blame. What was her endgame? I'm 21 now, but I still think about this interaction all the time. My mom's dog, Punky, was a very sweet, loving dog. She was an emotional support dog, and also trained to be a service dog for PTSD before she lost her leg. I've never seen her get aggressive with anyone in the entire 12 years she lived. She never growled or nipped at anyone. She loved all animals and people, and was a real gentle giant among our little terriers. What I'm getting at here was that her barking at something and being aggressive was so wildly uncharacteristic that I only saw it once. At the time, I was 11. I was at home with my 2 younger siblings. My stepdad was at work, and my mom ran up to the gas station to grab a couple of things. For reference, we lived in a 2-bedroom trailer in the middle of the woods, on a dead-end road at the time. You'd really have to make an effort to get down our road, find our house, navigate down our rickety driveway, and find the door. I was sitting at the computer, watching YouTube videos, when all of a sudden, 2 of my smaller dogs perked their heads up, barked a few times, and started investigating down the hall. The siblings were napping in the bedroom at the end of the hall at the time, so I figured that they got the dogs stirred up. But then, Punky suddenly stood up on the couch with her ears perked up. Her fur rose up on her back and her tail was straight up. Then she started barking very loudly. The bark boomed through the living room and echoed around, and all of a sudden, she lunged off of the couch and tore down the hallway. I was already on edge, because it was literally the first time I'd ever heard her bark. She's a Basenji mix, so her bark is more of a baying sound, but this was a big, loud, alert bark. I stood up and went to look, ready to fight off what I was assuming was a shadow monster in the hallway, based on how the dogs were acting. But then I heard it. Someone was knocking on the front door. We rarely ever had visitors, because of how weird our house was location-wise, so my 11-year-old mind had no clue what to do here. The knock drew the attention of the dogs, and they came running back down the hallway, all except for Punky, and I felt better with our 3 yappy dogs in the room with me, even if they were all the size of New York City rats. I opened the door just a bit, and standing on our porch was the sketchiest man I think I've ever seen. I can still picture him perfectly. He was a really thin, taller man with dark hair and a sunken face. He had bags under his eyes, and had this half-managed hair, sort of like he just gave it a quick brush and then figured it was good enough. Everything about him seemed a little too shallow. His clothes were nice, but they just seemed off. He was wearing a clean, newer-looking t-shirt and jeans, but he had what looked like a suit jacket on. All of his clothes were dark too, despite the fact that it was summer in Texas and the weather was definitely in the hundreds that day. He also had this plain, unlabeled bottle in his hand. It looked like the label had been covered up and taped over. I stared up at him in confusion, because I definitely didn't know this man, and I asked what he wanted. He smiled at me, but it looked forced and fake. It definitely looked exaggerated. Then he spoke in the same voice salesmen or retail workers do. He said, "Hey there, kid. I'm trying to sell this carpet cleaner here." And he shook the bottle at me. "Mind if I come in to show you how good it works?" Alarms were going off in my head, because he just seemed so off. Looking back with an adult perspective, the fact that he didn't ask if my parents were home is unnerving, because he probably knew that they weren't, and that's why he was there in the first place. I should have told him to get off of our property, or that I'd have to go get my mom, but I didn't. Instead, I just shook my head and said, "No, we don't have carpet." "Well, it works on other things." And he took a big step towards the door and shook the bottle at me. I started to freak out, realizing our front door didn't even have a lock, so closing the door on this guy would have been useless. At this point, I was terrified as my mind raced trying to decide what to say and do, when all of a sudden, I heard it. Punky had crept up from the hallway, lowered towards the ground with her teeth bared and snarling like she was a feral. She had slobber dripping from her mouth, her ears were down, and she was ready to pounce. The guy heard it too, and as I looked towards Punky, she tried to lunge past me and attack the guy. He freaked out and ran off the porch without another word, booking it down the driveway. I let Punky out along with the rest of our dogs, and they started chasing him. Our small dogs chased him down the driveway and stopped about halfway, barking like maniacs. Punky just stopped on the porch and watched him with her ears perked, just staring at him in the distance. That's when I saw someone join up with him as they continued running down the road. The second he disappeared, Punky's entire body language changed, and she went back to being the sweet dog I knew. She laid back down, with her mouth and throat covered in slobber. I realized my siblings were still down the hall, so I ran to check on them. When I got to the bedroom, my siblings were still sleeping. My relief quickly faded when I noticed that the bedroom window was wide open. The curtains were all pushed to one side, and the items on the dresser in front of the window were moved around. I had no doubt in my mind that someone tried to climb in through the window. From what I could gather, the bedroom door was visible from the couch, where Punky was sleeping, so I think someone was trying to climb through the window before Punky went after them and scared them off, and the man at the door was meant to distract me. They definitely didn't expect Punky, a bigger dog, because most of the time she was inside with my mom. Our smaller dogs were outside more often. I don't know what they intended to do, but after my mom got home, she took all of us to my aunt's house. On our way there, we saw the two men walking up someone else's driveway. I still don't know what their exact intentions were that night, but I'm glad I never had to find out. A few years ago, when I was 11, I was staying home alone with my little brother who was 7. At that time, it was about 9 p.m., dark and snowing, and we were reading in our rooms, getting ready to sleep for the night. To give some context for the layout of the house, my bedroom is directly to the left of the front door, and my brother's is directly to the right. Just as I was starting to doze off, I heard the front doorbell ring, followed by knocking. At first, I thought my parents had arrived, but it was strange that they didn't use the garage door or their keys to get in the house. I was a little creeped out, but mostly curious, so I got out of bed to look through the window that had a clear view of the driveway. I looked outside, expecting to see their car, but there was nothing but snow. As I approached the door, I heard a man's voice that was not my father's yelling from outside the door. "Would you like some cookies? We're selling Girl Scout cookies." I was shocked hearing this, considering the weather and the time of day. Saying nothing, I checked the peephole and peered through the side window, only to see that it was not a father with his girl as I expected. My heart dropped. Standing there was a fully grown man, maybe in his late 50s, with no box of cookies in sight. I can remember the gut-wrenching feeling of having to check the locks while he was right on the other side. He definitely heard this, since the 2 locks were the only thing separating myself and brother from a potential monster. He continued to knock and mention his cookies, as I considered calling the cops. That's when I remembered the blinds were open in my room where my brother was, with the light on. As I turned the corner into the doorway, I saw the man carefully peering into our window, eyeing my brother, who was distracted with his book. My heart was pounding now as I began to panic. In a move that took all of my willpower, I quickly turned off the lights and ran over to the window to close the blinds, in full view of the man. I double-checked all the locks in the house, closed all the blinds, and told my brother to go hang out in the walk-in closet upstairs since there weren't any windows. I called my mom, who was obviously horrified after hearing about the situation. She called the police and told me to wait inside the closet with my brother. The police finally arrived and searched the entire property. They found footprints in the snow near every door leading inside the house. The footprints led them back to the woods behind our house where they eventually lost them after reaching a main road. Ever since that night, my parents have been extra cautious when my brother and I are around adults, since it was almost like the person knew my parents wouldn't be home. They fear that it was someone we knew, but we still haven't found out who it was to this day. Just thinking about it still gives me shivers. I don't even like to think about what could have happened to us. I'll start by saying that nothing could have prepared me for what I was going to discover the morning after a night out. It started off as every other night would. My family and I were getting ready to head up to a local bar for a fundraising event. I had just turned 18 and was looking to have a chill night with friends and family. I knew most of the people there, so I was feeling really relaxed. While at the bar, I went to pay for my drink when the bartender told me it was already paid for. When I went to see who had paid for it, I saw my cousin's partner. He's about a decade older than me, give or take. I gave him a quick wave, and we did the normal niceties like, "Hi, how are you doing?" It's important to note that I'd barely spoken more than 2 words to him before, as he was usually quiet, or retreated to his room when we would go and visit my cousin. After saying thank you, I thought nothing of it. Nothing seemed off with our little interaction. By the end of the night, I had gathered my family together and told them I wanted to head home. At this point in time, I was still living at home with my mother, She had made plans to stay at my grandmother's house that night, so I was going to go home and sleep. Around 11:30 p.m., I went outside for a smoke before driving home. Just as I was about to head to my car, I heard someone call my name, so I turned to find my cousin's partner walking towards me. He asked if I was about to head home, which I immediately thought was weird. I told him that it was late and that I was calling it a night. Without skipping a beat, he mentioned the car that I drive and said he would see me around sometime. At this point, I got a bit creeped out, so I said goodnight and walked off to my car. There were plenty of people outside, so I wasn't necessarily concerned, but definitely uncomfortable. Once I got in the car, my phone started ringing and I looked to see that it was my mother. She was begging and pleading with me to go and stay at my grandmother's house for the night with her, saying that she had a really bad feeling. Initially, I was really annoyed. I just wanted to go home and go to sleep in my own bed, but she insisted. I couldn't understand why. I was used to being home alone at night, but she wouldn't let it go. I hung up and started driving home. I couldn't be bothered going to my grandma's when my house was just down the road. I was tired, and the only place I wanted to be was home. Not even halfway home, my phone went off again, so I pulled over to check it. It was my sister asking me to please go stay at my grandma's house. I was pissed off at this point and decided it would be easier going to my grandma's house instead of arguing with my family. When I got to my grandma's house, everyone was asleep. Now I was really pissed off, so I went straight to sleep. The night was uneventful, but I woke in the morning to my family talking about how they all had a feeling of dread, which is why they didn't want me to go home alone that night. My mother and I left to go home around lunchtime. As soon as we pulled in the driveway, I instantly felt off. Once I got to the door, I found a police card wedged into the door to call them as soon as possible. I went inside and found my mother's camera on the kitchen table. This was a huge red flag, considering it was in my bedroom before we left the house for the fundraiser. I went to my room, only to find that my entire room had been ransacked. No other room in the house had been touched. My blankets had been pulled back, and it looked like someone had been in my bed. My drawers were wide open, and my underwear was sprawled on the floor. Another one of my mother's cameras was also on the table where my TV was, which was directly opposite to my bed. By this point, my heart was pounding and my mind was racing. If I had gone home, like the plan all along, I would have made my way through the house and then crawled into bed without switching my lamp on. I'd done this so many times previously, and I wouldn't have seen the state of my room at all. My mother gave the police a call to find out what happened, and what she told them made the blood drain from my face. Police were alerted to a break-in at our next-door neighbor's house when our neighbors found a man wandering inside their house. The man claimed that he was my friend and went into the wrong house. They chased him out. Our house had a big 8x12 meter deck which looked over my neighbor's house. They called the police again when they spotted the same man smoking on our backyard deck. The police arrived at our house at 2 a.m., but since I wasn't home, no one answered the door. They noticed the lights were on, so they went inside through the back door which was left unlocked to investigate. They made their way through the house and found a man hiding in the bedroom in the dark. He couldn't give a reason why he was there or why he was hiding in my room. They arrested him and took him to the station, since they wanted to know if we knew him. Well, it turns out it was my cousin's partner, and he'd been hiding in my bedroom for over an hour waiting for me to get back because he knew I'd be going home that night. To this day, my mother and sister still can't explain how or why they knew I shouldn't go home. Whether it was a total coincidence or not, my mother's gut feeling saved me from going home alone that night. Ever since that night, I never question my mother when she has a bad feeling about something. Who knows what would have happened to me? He was charged with breaking and entering and spent some time in jail before being released and leaving the country. Although it doesn't seem like it, this happened quite a while back. I was in the later years of high school and was home alone for the night. My parents were at a wedding that required them to stay at a hotel, and my brother worked the night shift. At that time, my family lived in a very well-known East Coast city in a blue-collar neighborhood that was starting to take a nosedive. As a teenager, I was a bit of a loner. I wasn't a nerd or anything. I was a bigger dude who had friends and went on dates, but I'm a natural introvert, so I cherished the rare alone time that I got. On that particular weekend, I was looking forward to engaging in my normal empty house routine. My plan was to play some PlayStation on the big screen TV, then order a late takeout dinner like pizza and pig out while watching TV. Cecil was a beagle who was old as the hills and had been in our family for about 8 years. He was quiet and peaceful and spent his time begging for food and sleeping. Unlike most beagles, Cecil never howled or barked. He was more than content to rest his head on your lap and spend the night there. Around 1 a.m., I had just finished the last slice of pizza and was dozing off on the couch when I heard a bang coming from the back alleyway. It didn't really startle me, since it wasn't out of the ordinary. Anyone who has lived in a city would know that random noises could be heard at any time of the night. Cecil's head popped up off my lap and the hair on his back stood up. He was always a bit skittish, so I calmed him down and started dozing off again. Not more than 2 minutes later, I heard another bang, and Cecil did something I'd never seen him do before. He leapt off the couch and ran like the wind towards the door leading to the basement, barking and growling like a dog twice his size. The look on his face reminded me of a German Shepherd police dog. I'd never seen him like that before, which got my adrenaline pumping. Through the dog's barking, I could now make out a persistent banging. There was a seldom used door in the basement that led to our back alleyway. It was old and rusted, and was hard to open, even with the key, and it made a lot of noise. I suddenly realized that someone was trying to break into my house through my basement door. This is one thing I've learned from living in a bad neighborhood. If someone tries to get into your house and moves on after they realize the door is locked, they want your stuff. If someone is persistently trying to get into your house despite your door being locked, well, they want you. Knowing this, I rushed upstairs to grab the heavy wooded baseball bat that I kept under my bed for situations like this. Then, I headed down to the basement. I probably should have ran, but I was a macho teenager with a tough guy complex, and plus, I had nowhere to go. While I was heading down the stairs to my basement, Cecil blew past me with the speed and aggression of a dog half his age. Suddenly, I heard a man's voice yell out in fear, and the banging stopped on the other side of the door. Since he never actually broke in, I didn't call the cops or anyone else, which was probably the dumbest thing I've ever done. I just sat up for the rest of the night with the bat in my hand. My brother came home that morning, and I told him what had happened. We went to the basement door to take a look, and when we gave it a tug to open it, the whole door fell off. The psycho was one good shove away from getting into my house, but old Cecil scared him off. I'm pretty sure that lazy fat old dog saved my life. When I tell this story to people, they dismiss his actions as a dog doing what a dog was supposed to do, but when I tell you that Cecil never barked or moved that fast in his life, you can take that to the bank. It was almost like he knew the urgency, like he knew the door was going to give. A few years back, we had to have him put down because he just had no will to live anymore. Before the injection, I got a moment of alone time with him. I thanked him one last time for his friendship and for what he did that night. At this point, I was a grown man with a wife and kids. I'm convinced none of that would have happened without old Cecil. Thanks, pal. I miss you. This happened a few years ago when I was in college. I lived in Isla Vista, the student community at UCSB, notorious for being a party school. It fully lived up to its reputation. I liked to party, but these people were off the wall. As such, there were a lot of different people who put themselves in dangerous situations, drinking to excess and generally not being careful. It had a very isolated and insular vibe, and anyone hanging around who wasn't college-aged immediately looked strange and out of place. One night, after hanging out with some of my friends, I came home to my small house, where I lived with 2 other girls. It was around 2:30 a.m. We were all serious students, and weren't super big into the huge parties. When we did party, however, it was more like a small get-together with friends. We would often have a few people spend the night, either sleeping on the couches or the floor. That night, my roommates had a few people over who I didn't know. When I stepped inside, I noticed one of them had opted to sleep on the couch from the shadow that I saw laying there. I didn't turn the light on, since I didn't want to wake anyone. As I was passing the couch to enter my bedroom, I noticed that the figure was lying very stiff. He just had this weird energy to him. He was laying down, but it was like he was putting all of his energy into laying as still and rigid as possible. I paused, and the guy quickly jerked his head to face me, without moving his limbs, so quickly that it startled me. I could see his wide open eyes glinting in the dark. Figuring that I'd startled him, or he had too much to drink, I hurried past into my bedroom and locked the door. The dude made me nervous, and I wasn't taking any chances. After a while, I finally fell asleep. At 4:30 a.m., I woke up. There was a strange sound at my door, almost like someone was drumming their fingers against the wood very quietly. I laid still and listened. There were more quiet sounds, like someone scratching the door with their fingers, which got louder and louder, until it was clear that he was using both hands and scratching as fast and as hard as possible. It created an extremely loud and intimidating sound that filled me with fear. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand and texted my roommate, since I was afraid to make a sound. "Your friend is freaking me out. Can you talk to him? He's banging and scratching on my door." She didn't text back, probably because she was asleep. I texted my other roommate to the same effect, covering all my bases. Keep in mind that the scratching had been going on for a couple minutes at that point. I have no idea how he could have sustained it. Scratching a wooden door with your fingernails can't feel good. He also grabbed at the knob and jiggled it super forcefully. Because neither of them answered, I decided to call and really wake them up, though I was scared to make a sound. I know it sounds stupid, but there was something seriously terrifying about being teased like this through the door. I knew that he was trying to terrify me. I felt like a little kid, but I could tell this guy was screwed up or something, and considered calling the police. I still wanted to talk to my roommates, since it was probably one of their friends. The scratching stopped abruptly, and I called my roommate, who answered sleepily. "Your friend is really messed up. Can you please deal with it? I don't want to call the cops." She didn't say anything for several seconds, and when she did speak, her voice had no tiredness in it at all. "What friend?" "The guy that was sleeping on the couch," I said. She was quiet again. "We didn't have any guys over. Call the police." My adrenaline surged, and I told her to please lock the bedroom door as quickly as possible. I realized that I hadn't heard scratching in a while, and I had no clue where the guy had gone. Suddenly, I heard a loud banging in the other end of the house, where my roommates shared a bedroom. The bangs were followed by the sound of them screaming in fear. I quickly dialed the police, as this maniac proceeded to bang against the locked bedroom door of my two roommates as they screamed. The heaviness of the blows left no doubt that he was trying to break the door down. I alerted the 911 operator of the situation, and she dispatched 2 squad cars. The police in Isla Vista are generally used to peeling off drunks off the sidewalk and breaking up fights. This was really serious and strange, and I think the dispatcher got the sense from my tone how terrified I was, and she stayed on the phone with me. At one point, the banging stopped, and everything was quiet for a while. I talked with the dispatcher and suddenly looked down to see that the guy had slipped his fingers through the 1-inch gap between my door and the floor and was just kind of moving them around, making this weird growling sound. I screamed and backed away, trying to keep the little composure I had. When the cops showed up, I heard running and the sound of our glass sliding door opening and closing, and then he was gone. The cops never caught him. He had broken in through our side door by jimmying the lock somehow. My door was covered in what turned out to be huge gauges he'd made using a pair of scissors, which he discarded on the ground before he left. What terrifies me most about this was that I walked right past him. I looked him right in the face. I realized now that he was not trying to sleep, but was lying so stiff like that because he was hiding. He probably heard me open the front door and freaked out because he hadn't realized there was another girl living there and tried to blend into the couch in the darkness. At the time this happened, I was a 19-year-old sophomore in college. I was living on campus in their apartment-style dorms, and my college wasn't exactly in the nicest part of the city, so I'd usually drive a little bit farther to go grocery shopping, so I could be in a little bit more of a safer area. The night this happened, I was going to cook dinner and realized I didn't have some of the spices I needed. Normally, I would have just said forget it and made something else, but the meat had already been thawed for a day or so, and I needed to cook it. I debated just going to the Walmart that was 2 minutes away from my campus, but it was getting late, and I didn't want to go there by myself in the dark. That Walmart is right next to a major highway, and being a girl, by herself, I felt uncomfortable risking it. So instead, I went to the Walmart that was about 20 minutes away, a few towns over. I finally arrived and bought my spices, along with a few other things, and checked out with no problem. By the time I was done, it was now completely dark out. I was leaning over the front passenger side of my car, putting my bags on the seat, when I noticed a woman staring at my car. She was maybe in her 50s and was standing a short distance away, looking at the back of my car. At the time, I drove a really old car, and if you know a lot about cars, you'd be surprised that it was still running. I've had a few people in the past look at it, or come up and ask me about it. I figured that this is what that lady was doing, and I kind of ignored it. Until out of the corner of my eye, I saw her come around my car and stop about 2 feet behind where I was standing. I was parked next to a parking lot median, so it wasn't like she was getting in a car next to me. "Excuse me," she said. I turned around, saying, "Yes," kind of prepared to answer the "what year or model is your car" question. "My church is giving out leftover boxes of food from our food drive to people in need. Could I give you one? We have them in our car over there." This immediately set off an alarm in my head. I mean, she had just seen me put my groceries in my car. Why would I need something else if I just went shopping? Also, the churches and food pantries around my college were usually cleaned out after they had their shopping days for the people who really relied on things like food drives. There was hardly, if ever, anything that was just left over. I read enough of my friend's Facebook posts to know that this felt like a human trafficking lure. I stuttered over my words a bit at first, trying to figure out what to say, but finally got out, "Oh no, thank you, I'm good. I'd like to see it go to someone who could really use it." I felt like that was an okay response if she was really handing out boxes. "Are you sure? They're just right over here in my car," she said, taking a step and making the gap between us a little smaller. I was panicking. As she stepped closer, I tried to nonchalantly put my hand in my bag and look for the small pocket knife my dad had given me. My mind was racing as I tried to find the knife, but also tried to keep my face looking calm and not suspicious. I repeated to her that I was good, and the box of food should go to someone who could really use it. She finally seemed to let up, saying, "Okay, have a good night." I told her to have a good night as well. Then as soon as her back was turned, I got into my car and locked all the doors. As I pulled out of my parking spot, I noticed that the car she was walking to had 3 large men standing at the trunk of the car. They were barely illuminated by the parking lot lights, but I think it was an early 2000s white Nissan. As I tried to go down the parking lot aisle as fast as I could, I saw the men looking at the back of my car, just like the woman had. I then noticed where their eyes were shifted to. They weren't looking at my car, they were looking at my license plate. Just as I got to the end of the aisle, waiting to turn, I saw 2 of the men get in the front seats, and the other man and the woman get in the back seat. Their car started, and they began to pull out too. I was having a full-blown panic attack now. Just a week before, my friend had posted something on her Facebook about how 2 men followed her and her mom through a Walmart. Again, I had watched enough crime shows to know that this wasn't painting a pretty picture. I finally got my opportunity to turn, but the car was coming up behind me. I made the quick decision to take a really odd way back to campus. I made a ton of turns, and went through a lot of small streets instead of taking one of the 2 main roads. I don't think I saw the car again after I pulled out of the parking lot, but I was definitely not risking it. By the time I got back to my college, I had calmed down a little. I started to wonder if I was overthinking it, and maybe those people were really doing something good for the world. I decided that if they were really giving out boxes of food, then hopefully it does go to someone in need. That was, until I was walking behind my car, heading towards my building. The letters, SF, were faintly written in white sidewalk chalk on the brown paint of my car. I was shocked and terrified, knowing that I definitely didn't put that there. I practically dropped my bags on the ground and rushed to wipe the chalk off with the sleeve of my jacket. My car had been tagged. After a few seconds of wiping, the chalk was gone, so I locked my car, grabbed my bags, and raced into my building. I got into my dorm and saw the dinner I was supposed to make, but I had lost my appetite completely. I put everything away and went into my bedroom, still reeling over what had happened in the last 45 minutes. I sent the whole story as a Snapchat video to some of my friends, who were just as shocked as I was. My one friend said that she thinks the letters SF stood for single female. It made sense, which made the whole experience that much scarier. I called my mom afterward and told her everything that happened, and by the end of the call, she was sending me an Amazon package with pepper spray in it. I didn't go out after dark by myself for about 2 weeks after that happened, and I had a friend from campus go with me, or I just wouldn't go. The whole situation was terrifying, but I think the strangest part about all of it was that it was supposed to be a safer area. I drove all the way to that Walmart because I had a bad feeling about the one that was closest to me. I started going to the Walmart that was closer to me after that, and I've never had a negative experience since. It's hard to believe that all the stuff I've seen on TV and the internet could have almost happened to me. This happened in 2016, when I was a 17-year-old first-year college student in film school. When I left for college, I got my first apartment. It was really small, but I was really proud of my new independence. I never felt unsafe in the apartment for several reasons. There were multiple gates in the residence that needed to be opened through a code that only people who lived there knew. My door had 2 different locks, and it was right next to the university, so the majority of people who lived in the neighborhood were college people. Up until this point, I never had a problem with anyone, and the apartment and surrounding area was generally safe. I've always been careful to make sure I lock the door when I leave, and developed a habit to always check twice, just to be safe. I've never had a problem with the locks until a few months ago, when I left my apartment to go to class. When I went to lock the door, I couldn't get the key out of the lock. It was completely stuck. I went to get the caretaker of the building to help me, but he wasn't there, so I didn't have time to stick around since I'd be late for class. I knew I wouldn't be gone long, and since I didn't have much of a choice, I left the key inside the lock. I took off the lanyard on the key to make it less noticeable. When I got home a couple hours later, the caretaker was finally back, so he came up to my room to help me. I stood with him in the hallway for over a half hour, until he finally managed to get it out. He told me the lock was damaged, but it wasn't absolutely necessary to get a new one, since my door had 2 locks. I thanked him for his help, and he left, and that was the end of it. I really wasn't all too worried, because I'd still be able to use both of the locks when I was inside the apartment. Flash forward to 2 months later, I was taking out the trash one night around 11 PM while on the phone with my sister. We'd often talk on the phone since we were rarely able to see each other since I moved out. I was telling her about my plans that night, explaining how I was going to take a quick shower and then go to a party. Like I said before, I always lock the door, even when I'm only gone for a minute to take out the trash. Because of my main lock still being damaged, I only locked it once from the outside whenever I left. When I got back to my apartment, I froze in my steps when I found the door unlocked. I was almost positive that I locked it before, which immediately alarmed me. I went into the apartment and locked the door right away, just to make sure the other lock wasn't broken. Thankfully, it still worked, and I double locked myself inside. My apartment is only 215 square feet, so the layout is pretty simple. The main living room area is directly in front of the door across the room, and the bathroom is immediately on the left when you step in. I had left the bathroom door slightly open, and when I walked by it, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. In the bathtub, behind the shower curtain, I could see the silhouette of a large person standing in my shower. I instantly panicked and sprinted towards the door to leave as fast as I could. For whatever reason, the main lock that was damaged from about 2 months earlier was jammed and wouldn't turn, despite trying as hard as I possibly could. At that moment, my fight or flight instincts kicked in. Realizing I was completely trapped and in serious danger, my only other option was the window. Without really thinking, I jumped out of the window, figuring it was my only choice. The problem was that I lived on the 2nd floor, so I completely crushed my ankles on the landing. Despite the immense pain, I limped as fast as I could away from the building. When I was maybe 50 feet away, I looked back and made eye contact with the man staring at me through my window. As I limped further away, I eventually found a bush, so I hid by it and called the police, who luckily arrived in 10 minutes since I lived close to the police station. They kicked my door open and found a man sitting on my couch, holding a kitchen knife, waiting for me to come back. They arrested the guy and later told me he had already been arrested for assault, attempted kidnapping, and attempted murder. Since my apartment was in a very friendly neighborhood with mostly college students, he was able to get inside the building by having other people hold the door for him. Although I didn't see him at first, he must have heard me telling my sister I was going to take a shower, which was why he was waiting in the bathroom for me. The police determined that he crocheted my lock while I was taking out the trash, and later learned in questioning that he noticed me on school campus and followed me home several times before finally breaking in. Just a week before this happened, I had just gotten a new phone, so my old one was left on the counter. When he entered my apartment, he spotted the phone and put it in his pocket, thinking I'd have no way of calling for help. I don't live there anymore, but after that incident, the apartment gave everyone a building ID, so we had to scan them to get inside. Nothing bad in the neighborhood happened since then, but that night still haunts me to this day. I'm a 30-year-old female. I recently received a promising job offer that would almost pay double what I make in my current job, so I promptly set up the interview with the boss. The job is out of state, meaning I'd obviously have to travel, then move if I got it, but I was willing to, since I live alone in a small apartment. I found an Airbnb that was close to the city and booked it for 2 nights, since it was a 2-day interview. My first part of the interview was scheduled for 9:30 in the morning, so I planned on getting there the night before. As I was driving along the highway, my car got a flat tire. I don't have a spare in my car, so I had to wait for AAA. They didn't come until 2 hours after I called, where I learned that they don't give people spare tires, so they had to tow it. Luckily, I was able to get into a nearby car shop where they replaced it and sent me on my way. The unfortunate event delayed my trip by almost 4 hours, so I didn't even get to the Airbnb until 1 AM. I was bummed out that I'd be getting in so late, but stayed positive since I'd be able to make it to the interview in the morning. As I pulled up to the Airbnb, I noticed that the houses didn't have driveways, so all of the cars were parked in the street. Just to note, I didn't do much research on the house before booking it since I'd only be there for a couple days. The only things I looked for were a nice bedroom and kitchen. I found a parking spot just a couple houses down from my Airbnb, and I pulled up the email with the lockbox code to get the key. I punched the code in and it opened, and there was nothing. Great, I thought to myself. one problem right after the other. I assumed that the owner must have forgotten to put the key in the lockbox for me. I tried the front door handle, but it was locked, so I called the number listed for the owner several times, but there was no answer. I left a voice message, hopelessly explaining my situation to him, even though I knew I wouldn't hear back from him until the next day. I was pretty much screwed. As a last resort, I tried knocking on the door, hoping that by some miracle it would magically open. I walked back to my car and started searching for nearby hotels, since I didn't even have a place to stay for the night, and it was almost 2 a.m. Of course, every hotel in a reasonable distance was booked for the night because of some medical convention that they were having in the city. I could tell that I was not in a very safe area, so I really didn't want to sleep in my car. But after exhausting all my options, I had no choice. Just as I was about to recline the seat and close my eyes, a light inside the house I was supposed to be staying in flipped on. It concerned me, but my curiosity got the best of me, so I walked up to the house and knocked on the door. There was no answer for a minute, until I finally heard the deadbolt unlatch, and the door swung open. I was greeted by a man, maybe in his mid-30s, who was wearing jeans and a white t-shirt. I said, "Hi, do you live here?" And he looked at me with a confused look until he replied, "No, I'm renting it out for the week." I explained to him how I rented it out on Airbnb, but he told me that was weird because he rented it out on Zillow. So apparently, the owner must have made a mistake and accidentally listed the Airbnb as available, even though it was currently being rented. He introduced himself as Zach and asked if I wanted to come inside while we sorted everything out. I stepped in because I needed to warm up and use the restroom. The stress of the day started getting to me as I started sobbing in the bathroom, realizing I'd have to sleep in my car in a bad neighborhood or sleep in a house with some random guy. Either way, I was not looking forward to the night. I got myself together and came back out to see that he made us each a cup of tea. I'm an avid tea drinker and usually have a cup before bed every night, but I said no thanks, since I literally just met him and didn't trust him yet. We sat down at the table while I continued trying to find a place for the night. After 20 minutes of trying with no luck, he offered letting me stay with him for the night, mentioning that the neighborhood wasn't safe, which confirmed my assumption from earlier. He even offered to let me sleep in the bedroom while he'd sleep on the couch. Despite my better judgment, I accepted his offer, thanked him, said goodnight, then went to the bedroom. As I got in my room, I set my suitcase down on the dresser and quickly spotted his wallet. I'm usually not a nosy person, but I went through it just because of the situation. As soon as I opened it up, I found his ID. When I squinted my eyes to look at the picture, I saw his face. The strange thing is that the ID belonged to a man named Benjamin, and the name Zachary was definitely not on the card. I didn't want to psych myself out, so I calmly walked out of my room and set the wallet down in the kitchen and said, "You left your wallet in the room." Right as I said that, for the first time that night, I sensed a nervousness in his response. "Oh, okay, thanks, good night." He was holding a bottle of wine in his hand and it looked like I definitely caught him off guard. I nodded my head and walked back into the room, where I quickly realized that there was no lock on the door. I checked the bathroom and found the same thing. Great. At that point, I was beyond exhausted from the stress of the long day and quickly passed out. During the night, I was awakened to the sound of my door creaking open. I picked my head up and almost lost it when I saw a shadowy figure walk past the door and down the hallway towards the living room and kitchen area. I felt like I was going to throw up. Realizing that I was all alone and defenseless, with a complete stranger who was spying on me at night while I slept, I quietly sat up and grabbed my suitcase as I planned on sneaking out of the house. In order to get to the front door, you'd have to pass through the living room where he'd be, so I had to find another way out. I didn't even explore the house up until this point, since I had much bigger problems. I slowly opened the bedroom door, and as quietly as I could, I turned right into the hallway, where I began checking the other doors for an exit. There were 3 other doors, and the first 2 were storage rooms, so I assumed the other one would be too. However, the third and final door was much different. It was a guest bedroom. Right at that moment, I felt my blood turn cold as I stared at a broken window facing the backyard. It wasn't the exit I was hoping to find, but I took no time to hesitate and jumped out of it, all while making a ton of noise. I didn't care at this point though. As I landed the small drop down onto the grass, I realized that I most likely just spent the night with a squatter who broke into my Airbnb. I made my way around the side of the house, dragging my suitcase along as my heart was beating out of my chest. I popped the trunk, threw the suitcase in, and slammed it shut. Right as I did, I noticed a light flick on and watched as the front door swung open and Zach, or whoever it was, stared at me through the screen door. I got out of there faster than a bolt of lightning. I went straight to the police and told them a random man was staying in my Airbnb and was stalking me as I slept. I explained how he introduced himself as Zach, but his ID didn't match the name since it said Benjamin on it. They sent officers over to the house and found it completely vacant. By the time I left the police station, it was already after 5 a.m., and there was no way I'd be able to go to the interview. I drove straight home with no sleep and decided to sort everything out the next day. When I was almost home, I got a call from the Airbnb host, who apologized to me, saying that he completely forgot to put the key in the lockbox. I ignored his apology and asked him if the house was listed on Zillow as well. There was a couple-second pause until he replied no and asked why, seeming very confused. That response confirmed it for me. I spent the night in a house with a complete stranger who broke in and pretended to be renting it out, then stalked me. I don't even want to know what his plans were if I had not woken up and didn't escape. Looking back now, it was foolish of me to trust him, but at the time, in my desperation, it seemed like my only choice. Last winter, my family and I drove up to New York for the holidays. I'm a father of 2 kids. I have a 7-year-old son and a 4-year-old daughter. My wife's side of the family lives just about an hour outside of New York City. It's been our tradition for the past 5 years to drive up there for Christmas and visit, since I didn't have much family of my own. This year, we decided to look into Airbnb, since we would have more space to accommodate us for the week. We booked a beautiful 2-story house, just 10 minutes away from their residence. We arrived on Christmas Eve, then drove over to my wife's parents' house to celebrate. Once it started getting late, we drove back to the Airbnb to get some sleep, since we were planning on spending Christmas Day at their house again. However, when we woke up the next morning, we quickly realized that we got much more snow than they originally forecasted. Everything was covered in a thick blanket of white, and the snow was continuing to fall. The radar didn't look promising, and the updated forecast called for multiple inches of snow over the next few hours. We were pretty much snowed in, so we were left with no choice but to spend Christmas Day at the Airbnb. We still celebrated Christmas as a family and planned out some fun things to do for the day. Unfortunately, the weather continued to worsen as the week went on, preventing us from going anywhere. Despite the circumstances, we were making the best of our trip, playing in the snow and sledding down makeshift hills we built in the backyard. To a southern family who never experiences snow, we were enjoying it a lot more than the average person. However, on the evening of our 4th night there, our blissful week turned into an absolute nightmare. Around 5:30 p.m., my wife and I were in the kitchen cooking dinner, while my son and daughter were sledding and building snowmen in the backyard. From our vantage point, looking into the backyard from the kitchen window, we were able to monitor them the entire time, except for when they'd go down the little hill in the opposite direction of the house. I was washing my hands in the sink, where I could see my daughter, wearing her pink jacket, dragging her sled along the snow towards the hill. I watched as her head dropped below the horizon, as she let out cheerful screams and descended down the hill. I smiled with content, seeing that she was having the time of her life. Just as I dried my hands off, the timer to the microwave started beeping, so I walked over to it. My son came bursting through the back door, screaming. We assumed he got hurt, so we walked over to him and tried to see what happened. He wasn't saying anything, or at least anything we could make out, but he kept pointing towards the backyard as he continued to scream and cry. I instantly realized my daughter probably got hurt, so I slipped on my boots and clumsily sprinted through the snow-covered backyard to the hill. As soon as I was able to see what was at the bottom, I felt like my heart stopped. My daughter wasn't there, it was just her sled. I ran down to the bottom of the hill, where I was able to make out a set of footsteps that were clearly human and much bigger than a child's. The sun had pretty much set, and I needed to follow them, but I couldn't see. Part of me wanted to run into the woods and scream her name and find her, but a more logical and rational part of me took over. I ran back to the house and grabbed the flashlight we brought, along with a kitchen knife. Then I told my wife to call the police. Time was of the essence, and I knew every second that passed was another footstep further away from my daughter. I took no time to hesitate, and quickly followed the footsteps into the woods. Due to the time of year, most of the trees were bare, which provided a better line of vision into the woods. The moonlight illuminated the snow, providing just enough light to see a short distance ahead of me. Every part of me wanted to call out her name, but I knew if I did that, then the person would hear me as well, and most likely speed up. I had no idea if they were armed, but it didn't matter to me. I was willing to do whatever it took to save my daughter. I continued following the footsteps, keeping the fastest pace I could while keeping track. At the time, I had no idea how much time passed, but it had to be at least 15 minutes looking back. Eventually, I spotted a desolate road up ahead and quickly ran up to it, instantly realizing the footsteps were gone. My heart sank as I realized they could have gone anywhere. I made my way to the opposite side of the road, scanning for anything close to the resemblance of a human footstep. I assumed the person knew they'd be tracked, so they most likely were walking alongside the road. The problem was that I had no way of knowing which way they went. That was when I realized I was truly living in a nightmare. I had a 50-50 chance, and I had to decide in that moment to go left or right. I knew the police were probably already searching as well, but I had to make a decision at that moment. To this day, I don't know why, but something inside of me told me to turn left, and I did. I ran as fast as I ever have. The person could easily turn into the woods at any point off of the road, and I'd have no way of knowing. I took my chances and followed the shoulder of the road, forcing myself to not scream her name in fear of them hearing me. Just as I started thinking that they went the other way, I spotted the silhouette of a person walking alongside the road ahead. As I got closer, I was able to see my daughter in his arms, and then I got the biggest adrenaline rush of my life. I knew at any moment if that person had a gun, they would turn around and shoot me, but I had to try. I screamed at them to stop, and I saw the face of an old man turn around and look at me. He started running with her, but I was faster. As I screamed profanities at him, I charged at him with my knife in hand. As soon as he saw the knife, he dropped my daughter into the snow and began running away. I can't even describe to you how badly I wanted to chase him and get my justice, but now that I had my daughter, I wasn't going to leave her side. I embraced her in the tightest hug I'd ever given and kissed her on the forehead as we both cried uncontrollably. I had my daughter, and that was all that mattered. At that moment, the relief I felt was indescribable. I held her hand as we walked the opposite way up the road, back towards our Airbnb, until we eventually saw a police car driving down the road. The officer flipped his lights on and pulled right up in front of us. He drew his gun on me and ordered me to get on the ground. I tried explaining to him that I was her father and the guy was just up the road, but I understood he was just doing his job since they were looking for an abducted girl with a man. Shortly after, he confirmed that I was the father and gave us a ride to the police station. Unfortunately, this allowed the man to get away since they stopped me. I had to fill out a ton of paperwork until they finally sent us home for the night. To this day, we still don't know who the disgusting person was that tried kidnapping my daughter. I don't consider myself to be a hero in any way. I just did what any father would have done in that situation. The most important thing is that I have my family. I'm an Airbnb host. I listed my property on Airbnb 3 years ago. It's an old cabin that my grandpa used to live in before he passed, that's very secluded in the woods. After losing his wife over a decade ago, he moved out to the cabin in the woods, where he was surrounded by his favorite thing, nature. Now, I only live about a half hour away from the cabin. I always go there and clean it in between guests staying. Even though it's off of the beaten path, we usually have quite a lot of guests, especially in the summer. However, this past winter marked the first time I've ever had a problem hosting the Airbnb. I got a request from a girl named Bailey to stay at the cabin for the weekend. She was a college student who was taking the weekend to study for exams that she needed to pass. We went back and forth, and my initial impression was that she seemed polite and kind. My wife and I like to offer discounts for college students, so we let her stay for 20% off. Everything started out just like normal. My wife met her at the cabin, gave her the key, and drove back home to tell me that Bailey was content with the cabin. We had a 5-star rating that we wanted to keep, so we'd always accommodate the guests as best as possible. It was good for business. My wife and I went to bed pretty early that night, when we were awakened to my wife's phone ringing. Whenever we have a guest, my wife puts their phone number in as a favorite in her contacts, so they'll be able to get a hold of us at any time, even if we're sleeping with the Do Not Disturb setting turned on. Calls this late were unusual, so both of us sat up in bed and put her on speaker. "Hey, are you at the Airbnb right now?" My wife and I looked at each other with immediate concern. "No, we're not. Why? What's going on?" I keep hearing footsteps upstairs. I immediately grabbed the phone from my wife and told her no. We're calling the police now. We're gonna drive up there too. Can you lock yourself in a room? I handed the phone over to my wife while I called the police. My wife and I quickly got in our car. We'd never had any sort of problem with the cabin, not even a faucet leak. This whole situation had my wife and I hysterical. Who else would be in the cabin? We pulled up to our Airbnb, where there were several cop cars out front. We introduced ourselves to the police as the owners, and explained how we got a call from our guest, mentioning they heard footsteps inside. The officer looked at us with an upsetting expression and said, "Officers are still searching the cabin, but so far they haven't found anyone." Hearing that sent shivers down our spines, as we realized that our guest was potentially kidnapped. After further searching, there was still no sign of Bailey. They led us into the house to unlock some of the doors that we keep off limits to guests, in case she somehow managed to get inside. There was nothing. As we walked through the kitchen towards the front door to leave, I saw her laptop, along with several binders and a textbook, all flipped open, where she must have been studying at the time she called us. The immense discomfort of this situation made us sick. We eventually finished talking with the police and walked back outside, where canine units were preparing to search for her. We still haven't heard from her, nor have the police given us any promising updates. We just hope that she's okay. I've always been an avid outdoorsman. You wouldn't have to ask anyone close to me if I am or not. They'd all say the same thing. I practically live in the woods. I work as a maintenance park supervisor at one of the 20 metro parks in Ohio. I'm one of the few people that say they truly love their job. I spend the majority of each day in the woods, overseeing the staff and making sure that all the employees are following the checklists. I absolutely love nature, so getting paid to be around it is a win-win deal for me. When I'm not at work, I take every chance I get to go camping, hiking, or both. My 5-year-old daughter has obviously seen her fair share of nature given that I'm her parent, and she's developed a great love for it as well. Almost every Saturday, as long as the weather isn't bad, we take the day to go hiking. It's always been fun, peaceful, and a great way for us to bond. However, this past weekend's hiking trip was completely different. It started off just as any other Saturday. My daughter and I got up at 8 a.m. and bundled up in our hats, jackets, and gloves. The weather was calling for snow throughout the entire day, so we made sure to dress extra warm. Given that I generally knew every part of the park, we often made our makeshift hiking trails in vast wooded areas that even I was unfamiliar with. On this particular day, we hiked on one of our usual trails for a few miles, before we decided to explore an area that we'd never seen before. For situations like this, I've always kept blue ribbons in my backpack so that we could mark the trees every 20 yards so we wouldn't get lost. It was around 11 a.m. when we were already pretty deep into the woods. My daughter has incredible endurance, especially for her age, so our hike sometimes lasted 6 hours if we were feeling up to it. The snow was falling at a heavy rate, which made for a peaceful day as we talked and explored. The woods had a serene silence to them, which was only interrupted by our footsteps crunching in the snow. Sometime around this point, we decided to take a water break, so I cleared the snow off of a log and laid a blanket down so we could sit on it. We both sort of fell into a trance as we watched the snow cover everything around us. It was quite a sight to see. We were suddenly snapped out of that trance and brought back to reality when we heard a loud noise. It was so unexpected, and we both looked at each other in confusion as we tried to hone in on the strange sound. It was completely silent for a few seconds, until we heard it again, only this time much louder and clearer. At that moment, it felt like it got 20 degrees colder, but in the back of my mind, I knew what it was. It was a woman screaming at the top of her lungs. My daughter instantly clung onto me, visibly shaken from the ear-piercing noise. I was terrified, but I tried my best not to show it. Now, I know a lot of you will say that this was some sort of animal like a fox or a deer, but I can confidently recognize any noise an animal can make. I'm surrounded by them every day at work. This was not an animal. Although I tried to sound calm, my voice was shaky as I told my daughter it was just a fox. Thankfully, she wanted to turn back, and I agreed, since there was clearly something wrong. We started backtracking, and I began unwrapping my ribbons from the trees as we passed them. 5 minutes or so went by, and it was completely silent, so I started to relax a little bit. I struck up a conversation with my daughter to keep her mind off of it until we were interrupted by that terrifying scream again. Only this time, it was much closer. My heart started pounding as I realized that the sound was coming from the exact way we originally came. The sound echoing off the hills made it sound like it was coming from the east when we first heard it, but it was now apparent that it was coming from the north, in the exact direction we were walking. If this would have happened in literally any other part of the park, I'm confident that I would have been able to take an alternate route to our car. But since this was a massive unexplored area without any trails or maintenance work, I was completely unfamiliar. My only option was to continue backtracking to the ribbons, or we'd risk a great chance of getting lost. We continued walking, but my mind was flooding with terrible thoughts as I tried to make sense of why this woman was screaming. It sounded so close when we heard it at first, but after covering hundreds of feet, it still sounded like it was right in front of us. This person was screaming louder than anything I've ever heard in my entire life. More time passed, and we were still miles from the car. The screaming would occasionally start and stop, but the closer we got, the more frequent it became. It was getting more and more obvious to me that this was a horrendous scream. It was solely out of pain. That's when I decided to whip out my phone and call the police. Something was seriously wrong. Of course, being surrounded by large valleys and woods knocked out my service, so I had to wait. It wasn't very uncommon, since these metro parks had notorious drop zone spots where you'd have no chance of making a call until you reached higher ground. When I finally got service, I dialed the police. During the entire call, the screams were louder than ever and very easy to hear over the phone. We eventually noticed that the screams sounded to be coming from the right of us, which meant that we were thankfully passing them. Every part of me wanted to go towards the screaming to help whoever it was, but I knew I could be risking my daughter's life too, so I continued on. We eventually made it back to the car, where I met up with the police and marked the general area on a map for them. They ended up being very suspicious of me, but realized I had nothing to do with it after asking some questions. I've been checking the news every day since that Saturday, waiting for the dreaded news title to pop up on the screen, but there's been nothing. Who knows, maybe it was someone playing a sick prank. I'd like to think that, but something inside me knows what it really was. They were the desperate screams of a woman in tremendous pain. All I can do at this point is hope they're okay. My cousins and I have always been very close. They're twin brothers, named Ryan and Mitch. We grew up together in Pennsylvania, before my uncle got a new job, forcing them to relocate to Ohio. It was a big change for me, considering we grew up on the same street and saw each other just about every day for most of my life. We'd try to keep in touch, but life really got in the way of that as we got older. They both got full-time jobs while I was still in college, so we'd only see each other on the holidays if we were lucky. A couple months ago, Ryan and Mitch called me. We chatted for a while and caught up, pondering over our days as little kids who lived in the mountains of Pennsylvania. We soon got on the topic of cross-country skiing, which was something we used to regularly do back in the day. They mentioned how they missed our impromptu skiing days that we'd take on snow days, so we picked out a date and went with it. Since I didn't have a full-time job, I told them I'd come to Ohio. It would be just like the good old days, except it would be in a different state. The drive was only 4.5 hours away, so I planned on making a one-day trip. I left early on Saturday morning and made it there around 9:30 a.m. They mentioned how they found a pretty cool spot that was only 10 minutes away from their house, so we set off for the big day. We went down a long road that was pretty secluded from other houses and businesses in the area. It eventually led to a bridge that overlooked a ravine, hundreds of feet below. Just before the bridge, we parked, got out, geared up, and slowly made our way down the hill leading to the area below the bridge. Just having skis on felt so nostalgic and brought back all of my great childhood memories. I think my cousins felt the same way too, because we all felt the same euphoric feeling. It just snowed several inches the night before on top of the pre-existing snow, so the conditions were ideal for the day ahead. It was perfect. We explored vast amounts of land, and even found an abandoned train station by an old railroad. To our surprise, the door was unlocked, so we stepped inside and sat on the wooden bench that was drilled into the side of the wall by the main desk. Reminiscing thoughts of our childhood days continued to appear out of nowhere, and our conversation felt endless. At some point, Ryan stepped outside to smoke, while Mitch and I continued to chat. Just seconds after stepping out, Ryan came bursting in through the door with a panicked look on his face. All he said was, "Guys, someone's out there." I was pretty much in disbelief. I assumed that he was messing with us, until he looked out the window and said they were coming. Mitch and I got up to look, and sure enough, there was someone heading directly towards the building from the exact way we came from, maybe 100 feet away. I got worried, hoping that it wasn't a cop that somehow spotted us and was coming to write us a ticket for trespassing. It didn't make sense though, considering we were seemingly in the middle of nowhere. As the person approached, it was apparent that it was definitely not a cop. It was a man. He was wearing a red windbreaker with black shorts. He was very underdressed, given the single-digit temperatures. We stepped outside, expecting to see a local who was mad at us for going inside the building. As soon as the person noticed us, he stopped in his tracks. After no movement of any kind, Mitch yelled out, "Hey, you alright, man?" He didn't reply, but instead turned around and began walking the other way. It was strange, but we didn't really talk about it much after that. We went back inside and finished the food we packed with us, then decided it would be a good time to start heading back to the car. The guy was heading in the direction we came from towards our car, so Ryan and Mitch were persistent in getting back as fast as possible. By the time we packed up and got going, the man was long gone and completely out of sight. We followed our ski tracks from earlier in the snow, this time going much slower, since the land slightly inclined for most of the way. As soon as we got to where the man was originally standing, we found his footprints. We weren't exactly sure where he was now, but his footprints were heading right along our path we made from earlier. I started getting a little unsettled, as I started wondering if he'd been following us from a distance the whole day. Something just felt off. Why would he have followed us? And why was he heading directly along our path in the direction we came from? Another hour went by, and there was still no sight of the strange man from earlier. However, his footsteps were still visibly heading in the same direction we were. By now, I was starting to get really concerned, and I think Ryan and Mitch were too. He couldn't have been far. Finally, we spotted the bridge in the distance, so we picked up the pace in eager attempt to get to the car and leave. As I was looking ahead, I spotted something on the bridge that froze me in my tracks. The man was standing on top of the bridge, waving at us. We all looked at each other in disbelief. This person followed our path all the way out to the train station we found and was now waiting for us to get back. It definitely disturbed us a bit, but again, we were 3 grown men. The chances of us not being able to fight him off if it came to it were slim, so we didn't worry about it too much. We reached the point where we had to start ascending the land alongside the bridge that was maybe 50 feet away. We lost sight of the man as we ducked into the wooded area adjacent to the bridge. The climb at the end was the worst part, since the land was on a very steep incline. Once we made it to the top, I was the first to step out of the brush and look towards the bridge. He was gone, or at least I thought he was. As we started walking alongside the road, I spotted footsteps that emerged out of the woods ahead. The sun was starting to set, but the light provided just enough visibility to see his footsteps in the snow again. They led straight to the car. As soon as we got to the car, I noticed that the footsteps circled around the car several times, but the car was thankfully untouched. That's when I realized I could see the footprints on the side of the bridge from where he was standing before. I closely followed them, mostly out of curiosity and a little bit of concern. What I saw still unsettles me to this day. They led to the side of the bridge where we saw him standing, then they led to the other side. The only difference was that after the man walked to the other side of the bridge, the footsteps ended. Ryan and Mitch were shocked as I showed them, and we all got a sick feeling in our stomachs. We realized it had to be one of 2 things. Either the person somehow vanished in thin air after reaching that side, or they jumped off the bridge. I looked down towards the ravine, but it was too far away to make anything out. We were pretty shaken up by this, and tried to come to a reasonable conclusion as to what happened as we drove back home. Who knows? Maybe it was just a big misunderstanding, and the footprints went somewhere else. But unless all 3 of us are blind, I know for a fact that they didn't. Something inside me knows that the person jumped. As awful as it is to think about, it still leaves me with so many unanswered questions. Why did he follow us all that time? Did he need us to help him? Or was he planning on doing something terrible? Neither myself or my cousins will ever know what his intentions were that day. Ever since I retired as a school teacher, I've been in a perpetual state of boredom. Everyone always talked about the wonders of retirement, but I've seemed to have found the opposite. It's torture. Every day feels the exact same, and I hate not being productive. I was a high school science teacher for over 20 years. It's kept my mind young in my old age, but it's something I dearly miss. This past summer, I started searching for jobs in the area to give myself something to do. I stumbled across a bus driver position for an elementary school. I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, so there are several schools within a 15-mile radius of my house. I was a bit hesitant at first, since I didn't know if I had the energy to deal with the little kids, but after some contemplation, I took the job. It wasn't a great job by any means, since it had its negatives. I quickly learned within the first few weeks that some of the kids were extremely disobedient and rambunctious. However, my route was in a very good neighborhood, with many of the kids living in houses that I still couldn't afford even after working my entire life. The neighborhoods were very upper class to say the least. During the last week before winter break, I was doing my usual routine. I'd work in the morning, getting the kids to school, then go home for a few hours, before I'd have to go out again and drop them off in the afternoon. My afternoon shift on this day started off just like any other. There weren't as many kids taking the bus this day, so it looked like it was going to be a pretty quick shift. I was approaching the last neighborhood on the route for the day, which was pretty large. If I remember correctly, about 8 or 9 students lived in this development. Just like the entire area, the houses were very nice and it was a safe neighborhood, or at least I thought. As I pulled up to a stop at the end of a street to let 3 kids out, I noticed a man standing on the sidewalk looking at the bus as we approached. He had a maroon Volkswagen parked off to the side of the road. I assumed it was someone's parent, since many parents will wait outside for the kids to get dropped off. I have a pretty good memory, and I don't remember seeing this individual before. 2 second grader boys and 1 kindergartner girl got off, and I watched as they safely crossed the street, heading towards the man. It was cold and snowy out, so the windows were rolled up, but I noticed that the man seemed to be talking to the little girl. I couldn't make out the conversation, but from what I could tell, the girl looked uncomfortable as she inched away from him. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what was going on. That all quickly changed when the man raised his voice at the girl and she started running towards the bus. I opened the door and watched as she stepped inside the bus, crying and visibly shaken. I asked her if she knew who that man was, and she nodded her head yes. Confused, I stepped out of the bus and confronted the man, asking what the problem was. He spoke in a slurred tone, stumbling over his words. Even if the girl really knew him, his clear signs of intoxication were enough for me to know that the girl wasn't safe going in the car with him. I followed my gut and drove off, as the little girl continued to cry. I was pretty confused and a little worried at this point, but I decided to call my boss and ask once I dropped off the remaining kids. As soon as I looked in the rearview mirror, I noticed the car was closely following behind us. It was concerning, but I assumed he was just angry because I wouldn't let her go with him, since he was obviously drinking. Either way, I knew I wasn't in the wrong and wouldn't be punished for it. I kept on driving, as I noticed that the car continued to trail us. I wasn't comfortable with dropping off anyone else as long as the car was there, so I asked the little girl more about the man. She wouldn't say much. She only mentioned that it was her dad's friend. This put me in a difficult situation, since I still had several kids on the bus and was being followed by that car, which obviously prevented me from dropping off anyone else. I decided to call the school and have them contact the parents of the little girl to ask if they knew about her dad's friend. Well, shortly after I made that call, I got a call back from the school. They told me that the parents demanded to not let their daughter go with him. He should have no business being there. That was enough for me to involve the police. I spoke with the dispatcher, who told me to continue driving through the neighborhood until I saw a police cruiser. Within 5 minutes, I spotted 2 police cars turn down the streets and they flicked their lights on. They pulled the car over, arresting the man on the spot. I was able to safely finish my drop-offs after that, and I didn't hear anything until a couple days later. As I was picking up the students on the last day before Christmas break, the dad of the girl handed me a Christmas card that said thank you on it. I didn't open it until I got home, but once I did, I was shocked. He told me that the man who was attempting to pick up his daughter was a former employee of his and was just fired. They apparently got into a huge altercation at work. The man was familiar with the dad's family since he had him over, along with several other employees for dinner that previous summer. That story shook me to my core, as I realized that that man had some sort of revenge plotted. It sickened me trying to think about what he would have done to her. I'm just so grateful that I stuck around longer than usual when I noticed the man waiting for the bus, because if I'd left, it could have ended much worse. I grew up in a really safe city in the Midwest, in an even safer neighborhood. It was sort of set back in the woods, secluded from the main part of the town. I haven't had a lot of creepy encounters in my life, so this is pretty much the most afraid I've ever been. I was 14 at the time, and had just passed a babysitting essentials course at the rec. My neighborhood was very close-knit. All the kids on my street played together, and because of my 2 younger brothers, I would soon become the automatic babysitter for the 3 families we lived closest to. I'd looked after my brothers for short amounts of time, but this was my first job as a real babysitter, watching the 2 grade school-age children who lived across the street. They were family friends. Their parents promised that they would be back by 11 p.m., and I knew that my parents were home and ready to step in if I needed anything, so I was a little nervous, but felt like I had things under control. The kids were a novice babysitter's dream. They'd been trained that they're only allowed to choose 1 treat each before bed, and actually refused my offer to let them finish the show we were watching because it was their bedtime, and they still needed to brush their teeth first. I was taken back, but it made my job super easy, so I tucked them in and headed back downstairs to watch TV until their parents returned. The mom is an interior designer, so their house is spacious and absolutely beautiful. Their living room is at the back of the house, with floor-to-ceiling windows, and great views of the woods in their backyard. The couch is set up with its back to those windows, and I was watching TV with their elderly white lab, Alex. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something large brush past the window behind me. I thought it might just be a deer, but I was 14 and alone, and I have an active imagination, so I began to feel uneasy and pretty on edge. The parents weren't due back for another 2 hours, so I walked into the kitchen to call my mom and dad for reassurance. Alex followed me. Their kitchen faces the living room, with the house phone on the counter. Standing at the counter dialing my parents, I had a clear view through the broad archway into the living room, and out of those enormous windows into the backyard. Alex laid down at my feet as I stood next to the counter and told my mom that I thought I'd seen something out of the window. Hearing her voice was as comforting and reassuring as I thought it would be, so I told her that I didn't need Dad to come over, and that I'd call her if I needed anything at all. I hung up the phone and sat down on the floor to rub Alex's ears and belly for a few minutes, still kind of wary of the living room. After sitting on the couch not too long before I sat down, I caught a glimpse of something outside through the large windows. I looked harder, past the glare of the TV, and noticed a tiny light bobbing around in the woods. Probably just a neighbor, I thought. But as I watched, the light seemed to be moving in what was undeniably my direction. My whole body froze, and I stared as the light continued to get closer to the living room windows, and at some point, I realized, with complete and paralyzing horror, the light had grown large enough that the source was now right outside of the house. The beam swung from one side of the living room to the other, and then settled directly on my face. I don't even think I squinted in the bright light as it was shone through the window into my eyes. I was too startled. Alex snoozed on, placid in his old age, and entirely unaware that my heart had pretty much stopped beating. The light moved again, this time swinging away to illuminate a face from underneath. I saw dark eye sockets and the glowing curves of someone's cheeks, but the face's details were lost in the harsh angle of the flashlight's beam. At this point, I was trying with all my might to scream, or to move my fingers enough to dial 911, or to move out of view of the window. Literally anything would have been better than sitting there with my mouth open and tears in my eyes. But I'd never felt this kind of icy terror before, and was completely immobilized by it. Everything felt like it was moving in slow motion, and I was totally powerless. The light swung around to point at me, then quickly moved back underneath the horrible face outside. It repeated this pattern once or twice, and then it suddenly disappeared. The flashlight had been turned off, and for whatever reason, that was enough to finally let me move again. I quickly stood and hit dial, about to call 911, as I mentally debated whether to lock myself in the master bedroom with the children or just grab them and try to run out of the front door to my parents' house. My certification class had not prepared me for this. Before I even made it halfway down the hallway to grab the kids, I heard a loud boom and felt my gut leap into my throat. It sounded to be coming from the garage, but I remembered closing it earlier, so my mind raced as I tried to picture where the sound was coming from. I worked up the courage to peek my head into the garage, just to make sure it was closed, and thankfully, it was. The light from the kitchen provided just enough light to see a hammer on the father's toolkit, so I quickly grabbed it and ran back inside, locking the door behind me. Now that I had a weapon, I felt a bit safer, until that quickly changed when someone began pounding on the front door. The owners installed a Ring doorbell security system, so they'd be able to access the video footage and talk to whoever was at the front door. I frantically called their parents, praying that they'd answer as the pounding on the door continued. They finally picked up, and I explained our situation, telling them to check the video footage. Although it was hard to hear the conversation with the father and the person at the front door over the phone, I was able to catch some of the things they were saying. He told me to go open the front door. He explained how it was our neighbor who had to borrow some of our spices since his wife was trying to make a recipe. I had a million questions swirling through my mind as I heard this. None of it made sense. Why would the neighbor be spying on us and pounding on the door for spices? It didn't add up, and I was reluctant in doing so. That was when their mother took the phone back. "Look, I know you're scared right now, but you need to trust us and open that door right now. Please." Her voice strained with a tone that made it feel strangely genuine, and despite my worries, I knew I trusted her and started making my way to the front door. My whole body was shaking, but I kept reassuring myself it would be okay, even though it felt like the opposite. As I opened the door, a man dressed in a flannel and a pair of jeans came in and quickly introduced himself. He ran straight to the door leading into the house from the garage and made sure it was locked. He then asked me if I could borrow my phone, since I was still on the line with the children's parents. Given my vulnerability and total confusion, I handed him the phone and he began talking to the parents. After a minute or so, he concluded the conversation by saying, "Okay, you called them, right? Okay, good, bye." With the kids crying in the bedroom and a random man I'd never seen before holding my phone beside me who was previously pounding on the door, I was literally convinced that I was in some sort of dream. Just before I was about to pinch myself, the supposed neighbor quietly told me that there was a person trying to break in and he was going to keep us safe. He revealed a gun in his waistband and told me everything was going to be okay and the police were on their way. Well, fast forward to the next day, I finally learned what happened. Around 8:45 that night, the neighbor who came over was letting his dog out when he spotted a flashlight in the backyard. It was certainly out of the ordinary, so he continued to monitor it through the window once he got back inside. He watched as it approached the windows facing the back of the house and began looking in. Once he had a closer view, he could tell that it was a man, but was unable to make out the face. He watched as he started making his way around the house, in between the house I was babysitting in and the neighbor's house. He watched as he entered the side door of the garage, which is when I must have heard the booming sound. I can't even explain how lucky I am that I didn't get killed that night. When I opened the door to the garage to make sure it was shut and grabbed the hammer, the man was inside the dark garage with me the entire time, watching me from the darkness. It all makes sense to me now, like why the neighbor was frantically pounding on the door and how the parents told me he was there to grab spices. They knew that if they told us what was really happening, the kids, including myself, would have lost all composure. The police found the man who broke into the garage that night, and he tried attacking them. Thankfully, he was unsuccessful, and they arrested him on the spot. He was found to be in a drug-induced psychosis. I really look at life differently now, realizing that at any minute, it could be taken away. If it wasn't for that neighbor, I might not even be here telling this story today. After much wavering and second-guessing, I finally bit the bullet and returned to graduate school last fall. I'm sure several of you know how difficult it is to juggle a rigorous PhD program and a full-time job. I was going to need a small source of income, but wanted something that would allow my school to be my first priority. As luck would have it, a good friend of mine knew a family in desperate need of a quality babysitter. Their current sitter had recently graduated high school and was heading out of state for college. Initially, I felt a little odd accepting work as a babysitter. After all, I was in my mid-20s, a PhD student, and engaged to be married. But the hours were flexible, the money was fantastic, and I could anticipate a great deal of solid study hours after the toddler was sleeping soundly. To be quite honest, it was smooth sailing from the start. The family was overwhelmingly generous with their money, and their 3-year-old daughter, Gianna, was quite well behaved, even in all of her mischievous toddler glory. Over the next few months, I found myself up there several times a week, mostly relieving the mother, Marie, in the afternoons, so she could run errands and catch a coffee break. I occasionally sat on Saturdays, so the parents could enjoy date night to the movies. I wasn't especially fond of the weekend night shifts, especially because the family lived in a large home, high up in the mountains, surrounded by acres and acres of trees. During the day, their heavily wooded property was serene and majestic, but once darkness fell, it was eerie in its silence. I tried to keep my mind off of the creepy woods surrounding me outside by working on my laptop or burying my nose in a textbook. Everything changed this past February. It was an especially cold Saturday evening, and I was due to babysit around 7 that night. Marie's husband, Michael, was out of town on business, and she was attending her best friend's birthday get-together that evening. Armed with a backpack of heavy reading, I had my fiancé drop me off on his way to the store. The night was mellow. I heated up some frozen pizza, worked on schoolwork, and had the kids in bed by 8. I had an exam the following Tuesday, and admittedly had a lot of studying to conquer. My fiancé arrived around 9:50, about 10 minutes before I was expecting Marie to return home. Right at 10, we heard footsteps on the wraparound deck, and noticed Marie making her way to the front door. I remember finding it funny that I had been concentrating so hard, I didn't even hear her car pull in. My fiancé and I exchanged a knowing glance as Marie made her way into the house and immediately walked straight upstairs. It appeared she might have had one glass of wine too many that evening because she is usually very social and polite. I began to gather my things as my fiancé continued a game of solitaire on his phone. By the time we got down to the driveway, my fiancé and I both had baffled looks on our faces. Marie stood in the window, smiling down at us, waving her hand back and forth. I gave a short nod and waved, keeping my eyes on the gravel. We walked down the empty driveway towards the street, since Marie parks her car in the garage. "I'm not the only person who found that whole thing weird, right?" my fiancé asked. "Oh, relax. She was probably just tipsy," I said, closing the passenger side door. We began our trek down the winding roads, after a long night of babysitting. The drive from their house to the freeway was dark, lined with redwoods and deer, which I usually quite enjoyed. Then it hit me. I pawed at the handle of my purse, and for the first time, I noticed the bag's weight. I'd forgotten my textbook. Reluctant to turn around when we had already been driving for so long, I made amends with the fact that I absolutely needed that textbook if I had any chance of passing my exam. My fiancé let out a groan as he swung the wheel, turning back the way we came. As we made our way to the deck, I saw the burgundy spine of my textbook on the couch through the sliding glass door. I continued on to the front door and knocked on it. There was no answer. I knocked again and then tried the door handle, which was unlocked. We made our way into the house, making sure to keep our footsteps quiet. "Sorry, it's just me. I forgot my book," I said, trying to keep my voice down. My fiancé was a few steps behind me, peeking around the corner. As I stood at the bottom of the steps, I could see that all the lights were still on upstairs. I yelled, "Hey, it's me. You still awake?" There was complete silence. We walked towards the kitchen, and I noticed the answering machine was blinking. I hadn't noticed it before I left. There hadn't been any phone calls that night. I'm not exactly sure what compelled me to push play on that recorder, especially when, for all I knew, Marie and her daughter were both asleep. My fingers seemed to hover over that button for a mere second before I pushed it in. What I heard on that recording has never left me. The timestamp of the message was 10:14. We left the house at 10:05. "Hey sweetie, it's Mom. There's some kind of holdup on the highway here, maybe an accident or something. I'll probably be home about a half hour later than expected." I looked at my fiancé and my heart sank. My eyes flooded with tears. "Gianna?" I managed to sputter. My fiancé disappeared up the staircase, taking multiple steps at a time. After a painfully long minute, he sauntered down the stairs, much slower than he had ascended them. "Gianna's fine, sleeping soundly," he said, without emotion. I opened the garage, and sure enough, her car was not there. We searched every square inch of the house, and it was empty, except for us and her daughter. We went back into the living room, where we sat in silence, until Marie pulled up the driveway. She seemed exhausted, glad to be home, and off of the congested road. She chattered on about her evening, wrote me a check with a generous tip, thanked me for my patience, and smiled. We stumbled down to our car in a daze, still shocked and shook up from the night. I never had the heart to tell her what had happened that evening. I ended up canceling my next 2 shifts, faking a sickness. I finally emailed Marie, telling her that my program was getting especially intense, and that I didn't think I could continue babysitting for them. She bought the story, and now I'm free. Free from the house that I let a complete stranger stay, alone with her daughter. I'm a female, and this story took place 3 years ago, when I was 16. When I was in high school, I babysat on the odd occasion for a family I'd known since I was pretty young. They were great, really laid back, and it was the easiest babysitting job in the world, because the kids would usually be in bed before I got there and always slept really well. It had been about a year since I'd babysat for them. At that time, they had a new baby who was about 6 months old, so on this occasion, it was me, the baby, and the 3 little kids. I should really mention, before anything, that their house was completely amazing. It wasn't the flashiest from the outside, but it was huge, and although it was in a suburban street, it was positioned on a hill. So from the master bedroom upstairs, you could look out over the whole city. They had tons of CDs, which back then was really exciting for me. The kitchen was always full, and the whole place was decorated like an amazing art gallery, brilliantly designed and very spacious. They always had interesting stuff around too. That night, I noticed in the front room, amongst the kids' stuff, that there was a fake samurai sword. I remember laughing at it, thinking it looked too real to be a toy, and I waved it around a bit. It didn't surprise me though, they were really interesting people, and I always found unordinary things that I liked. The layout of the house was cool too. The front door opened almost directly into the living room, and off to the side, there was a giant spiral staircase leading upstairs to the bedrooms. The living room was fantastic, with tall windows overlooking the front garden and almost the entire street. The middle part of the house was completely open plan, with the kitchen and dining room spread out for what seemed like miles. Near the back of the house, they even had a small study room, which was more like a reading nook. From memory, it was just an armchair and 2 walls of books. My parents dropped me off around 8:30, and the mom and dad left soon after, telling me the kids were fast asleep, and that if I had any problems with the baby, I could wake their oldest daughter, who was good at settling him, and would help me if I needed it. I remember being comforted by that, because I knew virtually nothing about babies. I didn't need to, in the end, because the kids slept fine. But the important thing is that I felt safe and at ease. They told me they would be back around 1 AM, and to call if I needed anything. I wasn't worried, I'd done this countless times before, and even though it was a cold night with a harsh wind, I knew this house, and I knew nothing would happen. I felt completely at home. I felt so safe, actually, that when I had trouble locking the screen door after they'd gone, I didn't stress too much about it. I thought maybe it was jammed. I didn't have a key to the front door, and usually the screen door shut just fine. They lived in a good neighborhood though, and it didn't occur to me at the time that it was anything to worry about. I quickly forgot about it, and went to the study room to read, after quickly peeking in on the kids. I lost track of time for a while. I didn't have a phone when I was 16, and there was no clock in the reading nook. I was totally lost in a book, and before I knew it, a couple hours had gone by. But the passing of time was not what woke me from my reading stupor. I'd been deep in the book, but the eerie sounds of the gusting wind made a howling noise and drew my attention away from the book. I don't know why, but the noises gave me an unsettling feeling in my stomach, and I became a little paranoid. I thought, as I stared at the books on the walls, that maybe I'd just been sitting too long. So I got up and slowly wandered into the kitchen, with the intent of checking on the kids and then maybe watching some TV. The front living room was in darkness, and as I stepped into it on my way to the bedrooms, something stopped me dead in my tracks. With the light of the kitchen illuminating me from behind, I stood paralyzed by the sight of a man standing in the front garden. He didn't move, and I didn't either. I could see that he had shut the garden gate behind him, and from his position in the garden, it was clear he'd been walking towards the door, the same front door I couldn't get locked. I didn't know what to do, as the immediate terror overwhelmed me. I had no weapon. The door was unlocked, and I couldn't run because the kids were sleeping upstairs. He was huge, and I was small. He had a perfectly visible view of me, as his shadowy outline watched from the darkness. Dressed in all black, I've never seen anything more terrifying in my life. I knew if I didn't do something, he would come inside and get us. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted the fake samurai sword, and very slowly, bending down slightly, but not taking my eyes off of the figure in the garden, I picked it up and raised it in the air, letting him know I was armed. I don't know why, but I couldn't think of anything else. He stood there perfectly still, until he started walking right up to the screen door. My entire body was shaking, but I tried so hard to remain calm on the outside, even though every part of me wanted to scream and run. He had this blank, cold stare in his face, almost like a robot. I don't think he blinked once, as I watched his eyes staring dead center on me. This standoff felt like it lasted forever. Eventually, he turned and slowly walked towards the gate and walked away down the street. I stood there for a long time, watching him walk away, and then I ran to the front door and leaned against it, forcing it shut. I was 16, and I was stupid, so I never called anyone. I didn't even mention anything when my parents came to pick me up. I never told anyone. I thought everyone would blame me for putting the kids in danger, or the guy would somehow find out and come after me. The family today is fine, and nothing ever happened to them or their house after that night. But I always have been thankful for that moment of intense dread that caused me to leave the study, because if I hadn't, I don't even let myself think of how differently that night would have gone. This story happened a couple years ago at my work in the Netherlands. At the time, I had just started working as a security officer in an office building. The building was secluded in a forest area, away from any busy streets. It honestly creeped me out a bit, but the job itself would be easy since it's pretty much in the middle of nowhere. Nonetheless, it was work, and I was desperate to take anything that put money in my pocket. Once I started, a supervisor worked with me for the first week, teaching me what to do, and generally just showing me around the place. The building was huge. After I completed my training week, I was scheduled to work the first night by myself. I drove to work and took the shift over from my colleague at 9 p.m. He told me there were still some people left in the building, but they'd be leaving soon. Before starting my 15th floor patrol, I closed the main lobby entrance, so you'd only be able to exit when you're inside, and no outsiders would be able to come in. I eventually made my way up to the 15th floor, after patrolling through every other level. The few people left up there were packing up and ready to go, so I headed back down to the main floor with them. For my first run on my own, it went well. I went back to the front desk, and it was now around 11:30. The last guy walked out and wished me a good night. Once he left, I went back up to the 15th floor, checked all the offices, and locked it down. I went down to my front desk again, where I turned on the motion detector alarms. They were on every level, including every door that led outside. Within 5 minutes after putting the alarm on the 10th floor went off. Since I was the only one left in the building, it creeped me out, but then again, I signed up for this. The rules: if an alarm goes off, you call the security company before you take action. I told them I would investigate the alarm and call them back once I checked it out. Otherwise, if I didn't call back, they would send a police car to check it out as a precaution. I checked the entire 10th floor and found nothing. I made my way back down to the lobby to tell them it was a false alarm. Well, over the course of the next hour, the alarm on the 10th floor went off 5 more times. Every time I checked the floor, I couldn't find anything. It was definitely freaking me out, but I started to settle down, realizing that the sensor probably just needed to be replaced. Since this was my first day working alone, and the alarm went off so many times, the security company thought I was screwing things up, and wanted to file a complaint to my boss. That meant I would probably lose my job I've only had for a week. In retrospect, this was dumb of me, but because the alarm went off again, I didn't bother to tell security, since I'd already had several false alarms in the span of an hour. I went up to the 10th floor again. The only thing I had on me was a mag light, or flashlight, depending on where you're from. I went up to the 10th floor, checked around, and just like every time before, I found nothing. I really wanted to see it for myself, so I could at least confirm that it was a faulty sensor causing this. This time, I turned off the lights and stayed on the 10th floor, listening and watching for anything unusual. Within about 5 minutes, I heard something moving. My fists clenched, and I quickly felt droplets of sweat forming on my forehead. My initial assumption was now wrong, as I realized there was something or someone else on the floor. I turned on all the lights and tried to sound as manly as possible, saying something in the line of, "I know there's someone here, show yourself." As you can imagine, there was no response. I slowly walked closer and closer to the sound, where I realized it was coming from an office. I opened the door, turned on the lights, and found a little girl who couldn't have been older than 13, with long brown hair, wearing white pajamas. She was squatting on top of a desk, rocking back and forth, looking straight at me. The scary thing was that there was no emotion in her face or in her eyes. I couldn't explain it, but I felt this terrible energy in her that made me want to turn the other way and run, but I collected my nerves and took the girl by the hand. I walked her down to the front desk, offered her a Coke, but she didn't respond whatsoever. The only thing I could do was call my supervisor and tell him about what I had encountered. I explained the situation to him, and he said, "Stay right there. Don't let her leave. I'm on my way." When I hung up the phone, I continued to have a really bad feeling about this girl. There was something really wrong with her. It was also strange. Before my supervisor turned up, he called me and told me to call a mental asylum, which is a few miles away from the office building, just to check if someone was missing. So that's what I did. I called the asylum. I asked them if there was someone missing. I gave them a description of the girl sitting next to me, and it matched the description of the girl who was missing from the asylum. Then, the woman who answered became very serious in her tone. "Do not take your eyes off of her. She is really dangerous. You need to be careful." Well, fast forward to a week later. My supervisor told me the story of the girl I found, since he talked with the people from the asylum. It turns out, the little girl killed her mom, dad, and little brother while they were all asleep when she was 11. Even in the asylum, she wounded staff members, either by stabbing them with a pencil or, in one case, biting part of someone's ear off. My supervisor also mentioned that the girl was armed with a box cutter on the night I found her. To this day, we still have no clue how she ever came into the building. We checked all the cameras, and there was no footage of her entering the building. It still remains to be a mystery to all of us. I remember feeling sick in my stomach, while tears ran down my cheeks. I was sitting in my car, on the side of the highway around midnight, in between two major cities in Europe. Maybe less than an hour earlier, I fought bitterly with my girlfriend. We got mad at each other and had an argument. I couldn't stand it, so I got my keys, slammed the door, and drove off to my apartment a couple cities over. I had to take a break during my drive home. The episode with my girlfriend woke up emotions that were far too great for me to ignore. So I stood there on the side of the highway with the hazards on and the car shut off. It was silent around me, except the occasional truck passing by and the constant clicking of the blinking light. My body was tight, and in my mind, I ran through the events again and again. It was so unpleasant, and I didn't want to think about it, so I decided to get back in the car and continue driving. As I got in, I turned the key, but it wouldn't start. I continued to fumble around with it, turning it back and forth, until the key got stuck. I was stubborn and kept trying to get it out, but it wouldn't budge. Thoughts of staying the night on the highway rushed to the forefront of my thoughts. I foolishly forgot to grab my cell phone as I was storming out of the apartment while arguing with my girlfriend. I had no means to contact an emergency service or roadside assistance. Now the clicking of the blinking light was like a constant blow with a sledgehammer to my head. I shut it off. For the first time, I realized how dark it was around me. Trucks passed me by within the following minutes, but I did not want to step out of my car and wave one of the drivers down. I didn't trust them. Since I didn't have any other options, I stepped out of my car when it conveniently just started raining. Obviously, I knew where I was, since I regularly drive on that highway back and forth. I knew there was an exit a couple kilometers up the road, so I figured I'd walk on the side until I reached it. I knew there was a gas station, but I wasn't sure if it was 24 hours. I closed my car door shut and began walking on the other side of the guardrail, away from the road. The trees closest to me on the right side were illuminated by the moonlight, casting a shadowy glow deep into the woods. I have to confess, it really freaked me out. I had no particular reason to be afraid, but my mind turned the shadows into whatever I pictured in my imagination. After 15 minutes or so, I began to move up a small hill, and the rain turned to snow. It was snowing for a while there, because the ground was already covered in white. I ended up reaching the exit much sooner, realizing I miscalculated the distance, but that was alright. I was happy to be close to light, people, and a phone I could use. Right before the exit, there was a bridge that went over the highway. When I was about to pass under the bridge, I saw a person jogging on it. I stopped and looked up in surprise. I only made out a silhouette, yet I clearly saw a woman crossing the bridge. Who would want to jog after midnight on a road close to a highway with a wooded area on both sides? A few seconds later, she was gone. I looked to see if I could make her out within the darkness, but I couldn't. Still weirded out, I continued walking and passed under the bridge. Now, in order to take the exit by foot, I had to jump over the guardrail because there were thick bushes too close on that side that I was on. On the right side of me, behind the bushes, there was a trail. If you decided to walk up that trail, you'd arrive back at the bridge I mentioned. I slowly walked down the exit, trying not to fall, and then it happened. Out of nowhere, someone jumped on me from behind and pushed me face first to the ground in the middle of the road. I screamed in sudden terror and turned around, ignoring the pain in my chin and right ear. The person was already on their feet again. I screamed again in shock when I realized it was the same woman that was crossing the bridge. She shrieked, and with wide, crazy eyes and saliva dripping out of her mouth, she charged at me again. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my left eye. The woman scratched over my eyes and poked her fingers deep into my left eyeball. I stumbled backwards, and when she was running at me again, I was able to trip her into the guardrail. I broke down in the middle of the road, clutching my left eye. Moments passed, and I wasn't attacked again. Against all pain in my eye, I looked up, and through tears in both of my eyes, I saw the woman heading up the trail towards the bridge again. Adrenaline shot through my body. The pain felt numb as I rushed down the exit road, slipping and falling over several times during the process. I was terrified and only cared about getting out of there. When I finally reached the gas station, I basically threw myself into the door, opening it up. The guy behind the counter was shocked, seeing me all beat up and bloody. Unsurprisingly, the police were never able to find the woman. I was living in a quiet, largely suburban town last year, maybe 10 miles outside of the city. At the time, I walked to and from work, since it was only a few miles away from my house, and it was a quiet walk through mostly unpopulated areas. There is one stretch of road towards the end of the walk that can be fairly unnerving at night. In the 8 months that I've lived there, I never had a problem or encountered anyone strange at all. One night, after work around 9 p.m., I stopped at a restaurant to get some food and relax. Afterwards, I continued my walk for the last mile home. The creepy road I mentioned before has 2 lanes on each side and a guardrail. The surrounding area is flat, barren, and surrounded by woods. It's a straight shot for about a quarter mile, so you can see what's ahead for the most part. A major highway runs above, so there's an overpass bridge to walk under. Fortunately, it's dimly lit and has no area for people to hide, like some bridges have. I walked down the road and through the bridge with no issues. It was strangely quiet, even for a weeknight. There were no cars out, even on the highway above. By the time I'd left the restaurant, it was approaching 11 p.m., so for a small town, that wasn't really a surprise. Just beyond the bridge, I saw a male figure saunter out from behind an unlit, defunct gas station on the other side of the highway. At first, I thought he was just drunk and needed to take care of business behind the building after drinking all night and watching a game. I kept walking, keeping my eyes on him. We were about 40 feet away from each other when he decided to cross the highway over to my side. As he sauntered across, he started to drift diagonally in my direction, very slightly. I promptly began to cross over to the side he had come from, not taking my eyes off of him for a second. As we both reached the double line of the road, I realized that he drifted close enough that there were about 15 feet between us, and of course, no one was in sight. It was completely silent and dark. A couple streetlights illuminated the road from a few hundred feet in the distance. Then, he turned to face me and took 2 steps toward me. At times like these, with no warning, during those split seconds, different people do different things that are completely out of our control. Some people freeze, some people scream, some people run. Through no will of my own, I happen to be someone who yells at the top of my lungs. Surprising myself, I leaned toward him, pointed at him, and yelled, "Get out of here," at the top of my lungs. He froze, then immediately turned and walked away. Not moving my eyes from him, I continued to cross the street to the other side. All of this happened in just a few seconds. I hung back to watch him walk about 100 feet before I was ready to trail behind him from the other side of the road. My panic subsided, and I continued. I was now just a street away from my house. I continued watching him as he headed toward another gas station just across from my street. He put his hands on the windowsill and faced the building, staring down at his feet. I approached my street, which is conveniently directly across from where he was. There were only about 100 yards left until I was at my house. I tried to disappear into the shadows at one side of the street, so he wouldn't be able to see me from the gas station. Every 3 to 5 seconds, as I walked, I'd look back until the road curved and I could no longer see him. I still kept checking. Nothing. As I was halfway down the road, I did another head check, and what I saw set my adrenaline into overdrive. He was at the end of my road, running at me, fast. That's when I really panicked. I had no conscious control over what my body was doing. I had no time to think, but found myself sprinting faster than I'd ever run in my entire life. I never looked back, but knew he must be gaining ground quickly. I'm a small female, so I probably can't outrun any man. I pushed harder and harder, then began to turn the bend where my house was in view. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. The fear I felt was purely indescribable. That's when I dropped my keys and phone out of my hand. I had approximately zero time to decide what to do, but it's amazing what happens in panic mode. Every option was instantly weighed in my head. If I went to pick it up, I would close some distance between us, but I'd be able to get inside my house and call someone. If I don't pick up, I'd save time and distance, but may be locked out if my roommate isn't home, and will have to hide in the neighborhood and hope he doesn't find me. I lunged back, then grabbed the keys and phone, and turned to power sprint the last 70 or so feet to my house. Thankfully, despite my sheer horror and shakiness, I was able to get inside and immediately lock the door behind me, and lock myself upstairs as I sobbed profusely. My heart didn't stop racing for the next half hour. I'll never know what would have happened if he got close enough to grab me, but I won't have to find out. However, just when I thought this was the end of it, I woke up to my bike being stolen out of the garage the next morning. It really makes me wonder how many times he watched me walk back home before. That was the last time I ever walked alone at night. I hate being a babysitter. I never asked to be one, nor have I ever shown any interest in it. Well, that's the consequence you pay when you have parents who constantly travel for work. We live in Southern California, but they often leave the state. I'm a 16-year-old girl, and my little brother is 4. Don't get me wrong, I love him to death, but I'd be lying if I said I'd rather babysit him than hang out with my friends on the weekend. My parents would be gone on both Friday and Saturday, so I was responsible for watching my brother and staying home all weekend with him. I was laying in my bed on Friday night, smothering my ears into the pillow. My brother was throwing a huge fit because he was refusing to go to bed. Being the big sister, I'm often scolded by my brother for enforcing my parents' rules. I was beyond fed up and just wanted to sleep. After what felt like 10 hours, my brother finally stopped screaming in his room. I let out a sigh of relief as I pulled my blanket up and promptly passed out. I fell into a deep sleep out of pure exhaustion until I was jolted awake in the middle of the night by a loud scream. I instantly shot up out of bed, assuming that my brother was having a nightmare or somehow hurt himself. I tiptoed down the hall to his room, where the door was shut. As quietly as I could, I opened it and peered inside. His alarm clock was super bright, which acted as a nightlight, so I was able to see him pretty clearly. He was sound asleep in his bed. I haven't heard the scream since I woke up, so I started thinking that maybe it was in my dream. I made my way back into my room and closed my eyes, hoping that I'd be able to fall back asleep. That was when I heard it again, this time much more clearly. Someone was screaming outside. My heart started pounding and the adrenaline started hitting me. It sounded like it was very close to the house. I flew out of bed, this time much quicker, and looked out my window. Our neighborhood doesn't have streetlights, so it's usually pitch black when you look outside at night. However, I noticed that the front porch light was on. I completely froze. Our front porch light runs on a motion sensor, so there's absolutely no reason it should be on, especially in the middle of the night. I was freaking out, so I grabbed my phone before walking down the stairs to see on the first floor window if someone was there. As soon as I started walking down the stairs, my entire body froze. Someone was pounding on the door and screaming at the top of their lungs. I made my way down the rest of the stairs and peered through the front window. There was a woman wearing a torn-up sweater standing on the porch. She continued screaming and pounding on the door, causing the tables and the front walls of the house to violently shake. I had a terrible feeling that she was in trouble, but didn't know why she'd be banging on our house at 2 a.m. She didn't look familiar, and I have a pretty good idea of what most of the people look like in the neighborhood. Without even thinking, I impulsively screamed, "What do you want?" The screaming stopped for a second, until she started screaming for help and to be let in. Hearing that made me even more sick to my stomach. What if someone was really going after her, and I was the only person who could help? I seriously had no idea what to do, so I did what any other scared kid would do in this situation. I called my mom. She sleeps with her phone on Do Not Disturb, so if I ever needed to call her at night, I'd have to call her twice in order for the call to go through. Thankfully, she answered, definitely sounding concerned since this was something I'd never do. I didn't have to explain much, because the girl was screaming so loud that my mom easily heard it. I stumbled over my words as I whispered to her that someone was at the door screaming for help. She woke up my father, who immediately took the phone and told me not to answer it. He told me to hang up and call the police. That's exactly what I did. The female dispatcher answered the phone, and I explained everything that was going on. Just like my father, She instructed me to not open the door no matter what. While we were on the phone, I saw my brother standing at the top of the stairs, who was also screaming and crying now. There was too much going on at once, and I lost all of my composure. I now know that I shouldn't have done this, but I told the dispatcher I had to go. I hung up and called my parents back. Just like the mysterious woman outside and my brother, I was crying now too. I needed my parents' comfort, and although they couldn't do anything, I felt safer talking to them. I gave the phone to my brother, and my mom told him that everything was fine and to go back to his room. I don't know what it is, but mothers seem to have the power of comforting their children in any situation. I was still in shock from the whole thing, but I felt a little more grounded and calm. That didn't last long though, because the excessive screaming and pounding felt like it was getting louder and louder. The woman's voice sounded raspy, like she completely ruined her vocal cords from screaming. I just wanted it to stop, so I screamed back saying that the police were on their way. As soon as I said that, the screaming completely stopped. Everything felt strangely quiet and calm. I peeked out the window through the curtain to see what she was doing. What I saw still deeply disturbs me to this day. The girl wasn't alone. There was another man there. He wasn't attacking her, but was running alongside the girl towards the side of our house. My whole body was shaking as I realized that this was a complete setup. I ran to the back side of the house and made sure that every door was locked. After checking, I made my way back to the front, where I kept looking out the window, waiting for the police to arrive. Within a couple minutes, I saw the red and blue lights coming down the street. They searched the entire property and couldn't find them. Once they left, my parents were already on the way to the airport to catch the first flight back home. 2 days later, my mom and dad called me in while they were watching the news. There was a woman being interviewed who almost had an identical story to mine. She explained that her and her husband were sound asleep at their house, a couple miles away from ours, when they heard a woman screaming at the front door. The husband answered, and was instantly attacked by the woman and another man who popped out of the bushes. She explained how she locked herself in her room and called the police. By the time they got there, they were gone, but had stolen several expensive things from their house. Her husband was ultimately okay in the end, after being taken to the hospital for blunt force trauma injuries. He told the police that they were each armed with pistols. The woman was horrified from the event and warned everyone not to answer the door if they encountered that situation. It sickens me to think that I was a couple feet away from two psychopaths with guns. I can't even imagine what would have happened to me or my brother if I had opened the door. To this day, the deranged man and woman have still not been caught. I know what it feels like to be in a rough situation. A couple years ago, while I was driving home from a wedding, my car broke down on the side of the road and left me stranded by Death Valley in California. My phone had no service, and the only people who knew where I was were my friends at the wedding. They knew I'd be going home, but obviously wouldn't be checking in on me, given that I'm a fully grown man. I was down and out with my luck, until a good Samaritan pulled over and took me to the gas station. I tried offering him money, but he politely declined, and only asked me to do one thing: pay it forward. That situation led me to where I was on this day last month. I was driving home from my girlfriend's house one night, and my previous encounter with that kind man had completely slipped my mind. That was, until I approached a car pulled off on the side of the road. Mind you, this was the same road I broke down on 2 years ago, and the words, "pay it forward," reminded me of that day. Without much thought, I slowly pulled up to the side of the car and greeted a man who was standing outside with the hood open. He seemed like a nice guy, and I offered to give him a ride somewhere. He thanked me and hopped in. I mentioned how I was in a similar situation like this before, and how I had to pay it forward. He seemed strangely quiet, but nodded his head as I talked to him, while he blankly stared at the glove box of my car. He almost seemed sad, so I tried lightening him up with some conversation. I asked if he had any family, and he said no. I immediately felt awkward, realizing I probably made him even more uncomfortable. I randomly responded, "I'm sorry, neither do I," trying to sound relatable. I really have no idea why I said that. I'm an empathetic person, but in that moment, I felt a straining sense of tension between us. When I said that, it was like he snapped out of his trance. Right away, he started talking to me about his family more, and we got into a pretty deep conversation. He explained how his father killed his mother, and he was about to be homeless. In that moment, I felt really bad for him, and I tried to be as kind as possible. He soon got quiet again, but I didn't bother him. As soon as I was pulling into the gas station, he started tearing up and crying. He cried harder than anyone I've ever seen, and I immediately asked what was wrong. He didn't say a word for a few seconds, then shakily replied, "I was going to kill you and take your car." He revealed a large blade that he was carrying in his waistband and continued bawling his eyes out. I was absolutely shocked and terrified, realizing this guy was definitely unstable and just 2 feet away from me. I tried my best to not sound terrified and said something like, "It's okay, man, you don't need that." Although he confessed his plans, I still feared that he was contemplating what to do in his head. Before I could say anything else, he looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, you have to get out of the car." I don't know why I didn't listen right away and follow his command. I guess a part of me may have thought I could still talk him out of it. As soon as I tried, his mood quickly changed from sad to angry as he screamed at me and pointed the blade right against my stomach. That was the final straw for me. I got out of the car in the gas station parking lot and watched as he climbed over the passenger seat to the driver's seat, then sped off. I was shocked. The whole situation felt so surreal. Well, shortly after calling the police from the gas station phone, they found my car in a lake. The guy wasn't in my car, so the police began searching the lake and the surrounding area. The guy was driving my car very sporadically, because there were huge dents on almost every side of the car. The police still haven't found him, and I really have no idea if he's dead or alive. I just hope he learned his lesson from that incident and doesn't harm anyone else in the future. I recognize that I easily could have lost my life that night, and I learned my lesson as well. I really wish I never paid it forward. This happened last year. For a little background, I'm a 30-year-old male. I'm married and I have a baby daughter. I live in a rural Northern California town. It's pretty much right in the epicenter of the gold rush. It's always seemed to have a higher share of strange recluses and sovereign citizen types. That being said, this was by far the most frightening encounter I've ever experienced as a father. Some time ago, I ended up with an extra day off, so my wife and I decided to go for a drive and check out a semi-local gun show. From time to time, I'll buy tables at them. I have friends who get tables regularly, so we went to visit since I'm always looking for obscure parts and pieces for old military weapons. We had a hell of a winter last year, so unsurprisingly, it was a cold and gloomy day. We drove about an hour and knew the promoters, so we were able to walk right in. As I was passing tables in search of some cool stuff, I was carrying my daughter with me. She was very small and ridiculously cute, so everyone wanted to look at her and ask about her. This is normal from what I've observed from parents. As a side point, one grumpy lady told me she was way too young to be here. I looked at her confused and said she's like 3 months old. She'll never remember. Back on topic, there was one man who seemed a bit more excited than most men his age, but he said that he had worked as an EMT and in an INCU for years, so I guess it seemed reasonable that he was happy to see healthy babies. He passed me a few more times, moving against the crowd. He kept commenting on how beautiful she was. As babies often do at that age, my wife soon needed to feed our daughter. We went out to the car and had blinders in the back seat so she could have privacy and keep the baby from distractions. I turned on the heater and locked the doors, then went back in to help a buddy sell during a busier point. About 10 to 15 minutes later, my phone started ringing, with my frantic wife on the other end. About 3 minutes before, I noticed that the law enforcement had gotten up and walked outside of the show. It took a minute to calm her down, but apparently the guy had followed us outside and was watching closely. My wife got the sudden feeling that makes her hair stand up when she saw a shadow standing outside her door, blocking it from opening. At that same moment, a sheriff pulled up, who had also seen us go to the car. The officer asked what was going on, and the man tried to say he was talking to my wife, who rolled down the window slightly. She told the officer she did not, and didn't want to either. The officer asked him his name, and when he turned around to run the name, he tried to scurry away. He gave the officer a fake name, which is why the other officers got up. Once he was detained, he told the officers his real name, and within 1 minute of searching it up, the man was turned around and arrested on the spot. It turned out that he had felony warrants for kidnappings. The man was waiting for the nearby cars to leave and was about to try and take my wife and infant daughter. Had that cop not been right there, who knows how it could have unfolded. Just over 3 years ago, when I was fresh out of college, I had just moved back to my parents' house for the next 9 months, before I left the state for graduate school. Now, my parents are super chill, and they gave me my own space in the house, but being a young guy moving back home wasn't exactly ideal. I quickly got bored, so I started looking for work to pass the time and save up some money. Well, summer turned to winter, and I still hadn't found anything solid, but by then, I was desperate for anything. I ended up finding a part-time gig where I'd be doing bookkeeping for a small business owner that my dad knew. I didn't really want to do it since it didn't pay that much and I'd be in an office. But again, since my parents lived in the middle of nowhere surrounded by hundreds of acres of farms, I knew I had limited local opportunities to make some under-the-table cash. About the same time I started that job, a friend of mine in the city said that if I just paid him $200 a month and helped clean up, he'd basically let me crash in his living room until I was ready to move out of state. The company I began working for was a construction-type business, so my main task was to basically handle the accounting for all the money going in and out of the business. It was a close-knit type thing where everyone knew everyone, and the office only opened on days when someone was coming by. The old building where I worked was about 90 years old and at the top of a little hill. The downstairs used to be an old country bar until the 1970s, when the family business bought it cheap, cleared out the bar, and fenced in the property to use its parking lot area to store all their rental and equipment gear. I could generally come and go as I pleased, and work any hours I wanted as long as the work got done. If things were slow and there weren't any rentals for a couple days, I'd usually go in at 8 p.m. and stay until midnight or 1, since I knew I'd be alone. It had its perks, since I could listen to music and take my time. My office was on the second floor of the building above the old bar, and it looked out onto the long driveway. From my seat, I could easily see out the window, and once or twice saw a family of deer or raccoons scamper by. I always glanced out when I saw movement since it was very noticeable. It was incredibly remote, very still and quiet, so if something unusual occurred or something felt off, I definitely noticed it. One night during winter, it had snowed a few inches, and my dad texted me telling me to stay home. I had an old SUV that wasn't great in the snow, but I really wanted to get out of the house, so I went to work at my usual time around 8 p.m. When I'd arrive, I'd always leave the gates open at the bottom of the hill. Believe me, I was literally in the middle of nowhere, so no one would ever show up at night. I think the nearest house was about 3 miles away, so the building sat by itself at the dead end of an isolated road. On this particular night, I was in my second floor office, jamming out to music and drinking coffee. It was a total blizzard outside, so I kept glancing out the window admiring the night. The orangish-colored streetlight reflected onto the ground out front, which made for some great scenery. At one point, around midnight, I went downstairs to use the bathroom, and then came back up and got settled back into my work. As soon as I sat back down, I looked outside and saw a huge imprint of something in the fresh snow just below the light. It seemed like it must have been a huge animal that rolled around on its back. Since I didn't notice it just 15 minutes before, it had to have happened while I was in the bathroom, since I would have seen that type of movement for sure. I shook it off and assumed a bear or maybe even a farm animal had gotten loose, which wasn't an uncommon thing given the area. At around 2 in the morning, I packed up my stuff and went outside. I did my usual routine, where I got out of my car to lock the gate up. To be honest, I had pretty much forgotten about the imprint in the snow until I looked down at it. I was shocked to see that it wasn't just any imprint, but it was undeniably the imprint of a human-made snow angel. I used to do this when I was a kid, so I 100% knew for sure that's what it was. It was deliberately made underneath the light post. I could tell it wasn't from a kid, since the imprint was clearly from a very large person. That's when it hit me. Whoever made this snow angel had a perfect view of me in the window, and they waited for me to go downstairs to do it. I definitely would have heard or seen if someone drove up to our building, even if I was in the bathroom, which left only one other option. The person would have had to have walked deep into the freezing cold snow for several miles, stopped in front of our building, then make the snow angel in the small amount of time I wasn't sitting in front of my desk window. I glanced around for tracks in the snow, and saw that there was one set of footprints that led to the nearby woods to the right of the building. It was clear that the person didn't use the road, but instead came from the opposite side, which made me queasy just thinking about. There were literally acres of trees and woods in the direction the path led in. I looked around but didn't see anything at all, and at that point, I just wanted to get the hell out of there. When I got back in my car and drove a few feet, I realized that my boss would be there in like 4 hours, so he'd see the snow angel and assume I'd made it. It wouldn't have been that big of a deal at all, but I knew he'd make fun of me given that he'd already joked about me being a nerd. I got out of my car and opened the gate up really quick, then ran over and kicked the snow around it so it hid the angel. I was extremely insecure at the time, so it helped calm my nerves. As I walked back to the gate to lock it up, I continued trying to find the logical reason why the imprint was there. I honestly didn't have a good answer, which was still unsettling. The imprint was made 2 hours earlier, and the person was probably long gone by now, but that's when I heard it. When I was getting into my SUV, there was the loudest high-pitched laughing coming from the woods. It almost sounded like a fake laugh, like the Witch and Wizard of Oz or something. Whoever it was definitely close, and I knew they could definitely see me, but I couldn't see them at all, since I was standing directly under the streetlight looking into the darkness. After a few seconds of laughing, it stopped. Then everything became totally silent. I was totally frozen in place, and I could feel my heart beating through my ears. Then, the laughing started again, but it was much louder this time. It was more like screaming and laughing combined. Now, I've spent a lot of time in that area, and I know what coyotes and foxes sound like at night, with their high-pitched screeches during mating season. Any animal was immediately ruled out. I had no doubt in my mind that it was an adult man trying to emulate a woman laughing. He was deliberately trying to make a fake shriek laugh to scare me. It worked. After standing there frozen in fear for 5 seconds, I immediately was filled with adrenaline. I sprinted to my car, almost falling over multiple times, and got in. My car was facing the road ahead, so the backside of it was facing towards the woods. I threw the car in drive and floored it, which caused my car to fishtail and turn to the side. At this point, I felt like I was going to die, either from the person in the woods or a heart attack. As I was frantically turning the wheel to straighten my car out, I looked at the woods, and my heart felt like it completely stopped. Standing behind my car, maybe 10 yards away, was a bearded man holding a cardboard box. By some miracle, I straightened out my car and got out of there. After almost sliding off the road multiple times, I made it back home. Even though I only saw him for a split second, his image left an imprint in my mind that still disturbs me to this day. I didn't sleep at all that night and called my parents first thing in the morning. After talking it out, they concluded that it had to be someone from work playing a prank on me, but I disagree. My coworkers are not the type of people to prank each other. They were all very serious people in general. I didn't have any close friends left in that area that would do this, and if they did, they would certainly have brought it up to me by now. I found out later that the nearest house was a super old couple, so I highly doubt that it was one of them, which means whoever it was went out in the woods at night in the freezing cold to do this. When I brought it up to my boss, he reviewed the one security camera we have facing the front lot, and sure enough, parts of the encounter were caught on camera. The worst part about it is that he was seen walking towards the main door, right around the time I went downstairs to use the bathroom. Whether he actually entered the building or not is unknown, but the door was unlocked so he definitely could have. The thought of that person not only stalking me for hours in the middle of the night, but also being inside the building with me while I thought I was there alone terrifies me. To this day, we have no idea as to who it was or what their intentions were, but I'm seriously lucky to have made it out of there in time. When I was 7 years old, I had a playground fall at school that resulted in a serious cut to the back of my head that needed stitches. A few weeks later, my dad took me back to the doctors to have them removed. I was very brave and sat very still for the doctor, so as a reward, my dad bought me ice cream and took me to the beach for a paddle. It was a very small Australian town, and the beach was quite secluded. Even though it was the middle of summer, there were only a handful of slightly older children swimming. It was a known spot for kids and teenagers to hang out with their parents. When we got there, my dad walked me down to the water's edge and sternly warned me to stay in the shallow water and not go in any deeper than my knees. He had to use the restroom, so he told me he'd be right back and walked towards the pavilion. I know it sounds like he wasn't the most vigilant, but he was a good father. He was often quite absent-minded and sometimes irresponsible, which drove my mom insane. As I got in the water, I spotted an older boy, maybe 11 or 12 years old. He was paddling around a few meters away, but slowly came in closer to the shore, leaving the other children. As he approached, he called out to me. I remembered he had blonde hair and was smiling brightly. He asked me what my name was, and we struck up a typical childlike conversation. As we chatted, I quickly began filling him in on all the important details about my trip to the doctors earlier that morning, emphasizing that I had been very brave to impress him. My story seemed to amuse him, and he told me I should come out and swim a little deeper. I explained that I wasn't allowed in past my knees until my dad came back, because I couldn't swim very well yet and I'd get in trouble. He assured me that I couldn't possibly get into trouble if he was teaching me how to swim, and besides, my dad wouldn't see because he was gone. When I was still hesitant, he added, "Are you scared? I thought you were brave." I followed him out until my feet couldn't touch the bottom, and he immediately challenged me to a breath-holding contest underwater. It started off in a playful manner, until he started freaking me out. After the third or fourth round, I told him I needed a break, since I was out of breath and could barely swim. For some reason, he became upset hearing that, and heavily insisted that we should continue. I told him no, and that I had to get out of the water. Right as I said that, he forced my head underwater. I tried fighting him, but it was hard, given that he was twice my age and size. I know people will say I most likely exaggerated or confused myself because I was a kid at the time, but I remember this like it was yesterday. He had me underwater for at least a minute, until I managed to get my head up to take a deep breath, before being forced back under again. As my head came up for that split second, he was laughing hysterically and had a crazed look in his eyes. Probably only moments before I lost consciousness, the boy abruptly let go, and my dad lifted me out of the water. I can still see the look of bewilderment mixed with fear and rage on my dad's face. Then, for what seemed like a very long time, he patted my back while I screamed, sobbed, and coughed over his shoulder. By the time I had settled and my father satisfied that I was okay, the boy and the other kids were long gone. My dad still went driving around looking for them, but we lost them. Had that kid stuck around, I'm quite certain my dad would have killed him. Looking back now, I realized he had taken me out willingly, so the other kids wouldn't know what he was doing. Drowning an unattended young child really is the perfect crime since you could very easily pass it off as an accident. My parents and I never found out who that boy was, but I can say with complete certainty that he wanted to drown me. If it wasn't for my dad, I guarantee I wouldn't be telling this story. It was my third night in a row on the graveyard shift, despite my constant pleas for the daylight hours. At night, the place became purgatory. No matter how hard you'd scrub or how many times you'd mop, a thick film of filth remained on every surface. I would go hours without seeing a single car drive past. I often questioned if the rapture happened, and I was the only one left. We were a stone's throw from another 24-hour gas station franchise that was cleaner, properly lit, and had an equipment update within the last decade. So, needless to say, I had a lot of downtime. It was midnight, and I had 6.5 hours to kill. I was up front reading a book and doing my best not to look at the clock. As I would soon learn, I was being irresponsibly unaware of what was going on around me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a brown, wood panel station wagon pull up to a pump. 2 men exited the car and walked inside. One looked older. He was wearing a leather jacket that was the same shade of brown as his vehicle. The younger guy was close to my age. He wore a faded car hat coat and work boots. Both were covered in a layer of dirt or dust, suggesting recent manual labor. I greeted them and asked what I could help them with. They told me they weren't interested in buying anything, but they stopped to make sure everything was okay. I was appreciative, but also visibly confused. The younger man asked me, "Did you know you're being watched?" as he subtly gestured outside. Sure enough, I saw the dark outline of a man standing completely motionless near a streetlight. None of his features were visible, but I could tell he was staring directly at us. The older man said they had been driving by 45 minutes earlier and almost hit him because he was standing in the middle of the road. He theorized the man was possibly on drugs. They decided to take the long way home that night to see if the guy was still hanging around. Mind you, this was 45 minutes after they almost ran the guy over, making me wonder if he'd been watching me the whole night. I looked outside again to find he hadn't moved a muscle. He was positioned on the border of the streetlight's illumination. I noticed his jaw was moving, and it looked like he was talking to himself. I asked the younger man to lock the deadbolt on the front door, which was my only line of defense in this situation. They both agreed to wait with me inside the store while I contacted the police. Until that moment, I maintained composure, trying to not make it obvious that I felt extremely vulnerable. Here I was, at the mercy of 3 complete strangers, hoping the 2 I had in front of me were genuinely there to help. When the dispatch operator confirmed they had units on the way, I felt safe enough to end the call. I thanked the 2 men profusely and they walked out the door. After pausing for a moment, they turned around and came back inside. The younger one plainly stated, "Lock the door, he's coming this way." He immediately ducked back out of the door so I could lock myself in as he went outside. As I flipped the deadbolt into position, I could see the dark figure moving towards the building at an intentioned pace, making it across the parking lot in about 10 strides. He tried opening the door, but found it wouldn't budge. He asked the older man, "Where did the girl go?" who then tried to buy me some time by saying I was in the bathroom and I would be back in a minute. After this interaction, the man who tried getting in walked around the corner towards the bathroom door and disappeared behind the building. And of course, we didn't have cameras outside to keep employees safe on the job. The only 3 working security feeds happened to be all trained exclusively on where the cashier stood. It was at this point when the real fear began to set in, and I lost control of my composure. The unknown man who'd apparently been watching me for close to an hour was now waiting for me to exit the bathroom he thought I was in. I started to hyperventilate as thoughts about his motivations flooded my head. I peeked out of the window and saw the 2 gentlemen exchanging glances in muted discussion of how to proceed from there. Thankfully, a local police SUV tore down the street and into the parking lot of the building next door, turning on his flashers and quickly coming to a stop. As soon as I was absolutely sure the man was gone, I sat on the curb outside sucking every last drop of nicotine out of my cigarette I held in my trembling hand. As if I telepathically summoned her, my phone rang. It was my best friend. She tried calming me down, but all I could respond with was, "Get here now." 20 minutes later, all of my roommates showed up in a pickup truck and stayed with me long enough to feel comfortable again. As anticlimactic as it ended, it could have definitely been a lot worse. I don't even like to think about what could have happened, all because I wasn't paying attention. I'll never know the true will of that dark figure under the streetlight, and maybe that's for the best. I don't think I could easily get past knowing what could have lied in store for me, and I wish I could have gotten one of the gentlemen's contact information so I could have thanked them.